El Ministerio y el Gobierno colombiano decidió
The
en el
ministry and the
2013 ser
Colombian
parte de la coalición del clima y el aire
government
limpio,
in 2013
reiterando su
made part
compromiso con el
of the
clima
Clean Air
y con la salud de
Coalition
los
commitment
colombianos.
with the climate
Desde hace
and the
unos
Colombian
5 años
people.
atrás,
5
venimos
years
trabajando en
ago,
unas mesas
we've
permanentes con
been
el sector
working
ladrillero
with the brick
que buscan
sector,
generar
looking
conocimiento
forward
y
to
articular
generate
acciones
knowledge and
para
articulate
mejorar la calidad del
activities in
aire
order
en
to improve
torno a
the air
este
quality
sector
around
productivo del país.
the brick sector in Colombia. With these programs, we we've led that we are organized in the brick sector. Small entrepreneurs and aircraft people start having work towards the same goal, having a position, a place in a table where you discuss the problems we have in the brick sector nationwide. We've been able to create synergies in each of the brick sectors in Colombia. We have set our proposals in changing public policies. And it is grateful to know and be able to know the context nationwide
El
in our
sector
sector of
ladrillero en
brickmaking.
Colombia
In
era una de las
Colombia,
principales fuentes de
that was
material
one of
particulado
the
que
particulate
afectaba a la
matters
comunidad en temas
that
de presas
entered the
cardiovasculares. Se
communities in
reconoce el
problems
trabajo que ha
of
tenido
breeding
la CAEM, Corporación
situations.
Ambiental Empresarial,
The
que
entrepreneurial
desde mucho
corporation
tiempo
CAIM,
atrás la
very long
iniciativa
time
viene trabajando con
ago,
el sector
with this
ladrillero
initiative,
y
have
desde
been
sus
working with
inicios
the brick
ha aportado
sector
conocimiento
making.
técnico
And they
y nos
have
ha
contributed
permitido
with
un
technical
acercamiento
knowledge, and
con
they have
personas en
approached
campo, con
with people in
conocimiento
field with
y a
knowledge
través de
and
identificación de
through
tecnologías de reducción de
identification
emisiones.
of
A partir de
emission
ese
reducing
momento, el
technologies.
ladrillero
From
ha
that
empezado a
moment
tener
on,
como un
brick
cambio
makers
de
have changed
conciencia y
their
mentalidad de que es
mindsets
importante controlar las
in the
emisiones,
sense that
pero además
they
de
think
eso,
now it is important to control emissions and
medirlas.
also measure them. All companies are invested in having
Las
cleaner
mediciones nos dan una
emissions.
información
Those
técnica que nos
measures
permite
give
a
us
todos hablar
technical
en los mismos
information
términos.
to speak in the same
Sin
terms with
mediciones
everybody
estamos hablando en
without
abstracto.
measurements.
Hemos, como
We are
país,
speaking in
reducido el
abstract.
número
As a
de
country, we have
hornos
reduced
artesanales y
the number of
promovido que se generen
aircraft
mayores
kilns
actualizaciones
and they
tecnológicas que se ven
updated
representadas en reducciones de emisiones
technologically
contaminantes. Ya están
and they
empezando a
reduced
construir chimeneas, a
pollution.
diseñar hornos
They
como
designed
mejorados,
kilns,
haciéndoles de pronto
improved
una
kilns,
cúpula y
making
dirigiendo a
a
todos los gases de la
cover
combustión a un punto, buscando la
and
medición y
leading
el control.
combustion, looking for a measurement and control. It is a good way to control or taking care of the health of the community, the workers around us, and ourselves. We as a sector are more aware of the responsibility we have and the compliance we have to
El
have
sector
in
ladrillero
that
que
regard.
representamos
The
es un
brick
sector
sector we
industrial,
support, it is an industrial
formal,
sector, it is a formal
sometido a
sector,
la ley en
submitted to
toda su
law in the
extensión
full
desde el punto
extent,
de vista del medio
from
ambiente, de regulación
environment point of
económica.
view,
A nivel
economic
internacional se
regulations.
reconoce el trabajo de
Internationally, that
Colombia,
work
de
of
la
Colombia
CAEM
is
en
recognized
materia de las
in
mediciones y trabajo
matters of
técnico y científico
measurement,
que se ha dado con
technical,
el sector
scientific work
ladrillero.
with development with the brickmaking sector. Special thanks to the Entrepreneurial Environmental Corporation and the Clean Air Coalition for keeping us in mind. More than 10 years in which, together with them, we have achieved many processes that we have included in our organization. Being included in the National Brickmaking Association is a dream come true. Good morning, all attendants in this event today. Thank you for being with us today. First of all, Happy New Year, full of success and prosperity. We feel close to you. Today, we have the fifth session of Knowledge Transference. Our people of Asia and Colombia are present here with a webinar where we're going to talk about modeling air quality and how this is translated into public policies. We have experts participation today, academic researchers. They are renowned in air quality. We have an international guest also. Thank you very much for your attendance and your presence today. Our agenda starts with my peer, David Beltran. He is in Zoom webinar. Let's hope you enjoy this talk. And since we have simultaneous interpretation, when we have Spanish speaking, you need to use the English button. and vice versa. When the presentation is in English, you can use the Spanish button. We can help you through the chat feature. Mr. David, good morning. He's a chemical engineer with masters in environmental studies. He's going to be today with a presentation related to modeling, measurement, and translation into public policies. Sustainability in action.
Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning, you all. This presentation is just an introduction of what in KIME we've been working in modeling in air quality in order to assess possible impacts associated to the brick sector, brick making sector, together with the problems this carries on. Emissions of black carbon and the emission campaigns we have carried out in Colombia. My name is David Felipe Beltran Gomez. I'm chemical engineer from the National University, Masters in Environmental Management, emphasis in risk associated to air contamination, air pollution, and greenhouse management in the industrial sector. Practically, through this exercise we developed, through the brick sector, we found several conditions that could be applicable to other areas and other sectors in Colombia. Those brick-making companies, we're going to present a case study. In sense, how to collect information, and this generated certain interesting deliverables products that could be worked for other regions with several physicochemical and other environmental characteristics that could generate a change in the mindset, change in certain specificities to understand pollution problems depending on the emission point. In that sense, the focus given to this analysis is speaking first of the decision makers. Who are those? In this case study, we found that our main decision maker is the entrepreneur. Normally, when we talk about air quality, the emphasis is in authorities, environmental authorities, specifically licensing and environmental studies or other studies determining the attainment of a license. In that idea, that type of information was reviewed traditionally by the environmental authorities in Colombia that grant or award that license. We understood that these tools need to be more important for the decision maker that is principal, generating the budget in order to make changes in the infrastructure of that company, the entrepreneur. Likewise, this information is very convenient for local, regional, national governments because the local government has the possibility to have raw materials in order to make actions, take actions whenever they find zones, because when you find several industrial activities, you can find pollution in short, middle, or long term. The same case, decision makers are associations. If I have a problem, let's say in Bogota area, that same problem could have the same characteristics, for example, in other areas, for example, Nemoco, Cucuta, on the coffee growing area in Colombia, for example. That possibility of understanding the information in other contexts give the possibility to generate information. It could be important for associations, in this case, entrepreneurial associations. From the point of view of information provided to the entrepreneur, there's the possibility also that this information could be supplied to customers and suppliers. In the sense that this approach, since what we have done in this exercise of assessment, of PM2, 2.5, and black carbon assessment in the brick-making sector in Colombia, this has the possibility to be assessed and compared from the approach to understand the life cycle. For example, a better quality in my products, in my raw materials, could have the capability to reduce the impact in the niche of work in my work area as an entrepreneur. Now, in developing this case study, we started with a series of questions. What do you want to model or assess? In air quality, we have several types of analysis. You can analyze what is happening, for example, particles that are derivated from my gases, my productive process, noise. This is not the case of the brick-making sector, but there are certain industries that generate noise, environmental noise, or even going beyond greenhouse effects and what is the effect in the society in general, in a community. Why do you want to make a model? What are the hypotheses or scenarios? The location of this case study, which is the industrial sector of the Mochuelo Industrial Park, it has certain particular features in emissions within that area and possible scenarios of making better measures for that specific park. How to generate changes in structure, in the industrial structure that could happen. Likewise, we can think in micro levels or big levels or at a regional level. What are the relationships? What would happen if, when implementing good practices in brick making, this could be general throughout Colombia? What changes could be made in benefits associated to the better air quality? How to represent that phenomenon? Then you see what is the best algorithm. What can respond my hypothesis that I already presented. In this case study, the modeling could be particles and cases through a dispersion model, or in a possible impact in the future in improving air quality, black carbon, and improving emissions of 2.5 or greenhouse effect gases. How to generate changes in health benefits, public health benefits, or other co-benefits, economically speaking. Case study is the mining park, Mochuelo Mining Park. It is one of the areas where we have best information from the industrial people. This is one of the main elements we developed for this case study, the availability of information, because it is detailed in order to generate a model. If we don't have data, for example, on how this mining park behaves, this is the whole block of the park. If we don't have enough information on how the emission sources behave in that mining park, we don't have the possibility to develop a certain model or have a working scenario. In that order of ideas, we have focused sources, area sources, and park sources. We had, of course, certain particularities. The complexity of topography in the area, where we saw those significant changes in elevation. This is a very rocky, a very mountain range area. There's a valley also. We have certain conditions of certain external emission sources. For example, the Doña Juana sanitary filling, which is in this area. And we have other consideration, meteorology, climate. Practically, the behavior of wind is represented in this point. This allows that the meteorological information in this area comes mainly from the southeast area from the emission source. We also have a particularity in certain sectors of those emission sources, whether internally, this is Mochuelo Bajo village, and northwards, we have the urban area of Bogota. So all these particularities tell me what would be the best algorithm I can use in order to make this analysis on the possible particulate emissions generated in the chimneys of the mining park, specifically the brick making chimneys. The mining park has another particularity. There are other pollution sources different to the brick making sector, concrete making and asphalt making industries. What does the entrepreneur expect with this information? Practically, improve the certainty of interaction between pollution and sources. If I have several types of emission sources from the industrial point of view, what would be the contribution to the brick making sector compared to other sources close to my study area? Improve the characterization of the environment in order to avoid pollution. In the case of the sanitary filling, it is well known that historically there are cases where there are openings, problems with the sanitary filling, and this generates that the emissions, for example, very offensive odors generate particles and they go to sensitive receivers. So, for example, local problems associated to air pollution due to particles increase the perception or the bad situation in a community on air pollution. Cost reduction in avoiding pollution events. How do I guarantee that out of an inventory of emissions that is well detailed, I can know who could be the biggest generator, pollution generator, or particle generator, or atmosphere pollutant generator? Reduction of associated risks to pollution, legally and economically. So we go beyond to just exposure to particles in a short term. It could be a disease or it could be death. We can have also the analysis of the legal effects for the entrepreneur for generating intensive pollutants, the social misperception of the communities in regard to that entrepreneur, and economically speaking, all of the problems, all of the budget necessary to support before the authorities, or they are managing the air pollution, or they are generating an impact, and it is necessary to generate a compensation or a solution to that problem. So, in that sense, we have these conditions, these characteristics in two sources in that area. Here we have the methodology, the wind heterogeneous situation. There could be currents of wind from the west of, it could generate pollutant perception in the northern of the Mochuelo Industrial Park. This is the reality of the air movement of the south of Bogota. This is the component showing the exposure to pollutants, particulate materials. So this makes that all this information for decision making is a very valuable tool for the specific sector we are assessing in this moment. Keeping the particularities of possible receivers of this affectation, we have then that first step developed for this analysis is to know what we're going to model. We could be working in hot emissions or cold emissions. This was done in hot emissions associated to fuel consumption. Mainly, Emphasis was done on availability of information in order to generate dispersion models. In this case, cooking bricks. Because of the type of database, information for other emission sources was not enough, was not sufficiently thought of, detailed, in order to make a premise of the same emission source in order to translate it to other sources, for example, mineral extraction areas, type of transportation done in order to transport those materials, those mineral raw materials within the plant. There are differences in the use of technologies in certain cases or areas of material extraction. They are not homogeneous. You cannot work at the same time with the same statement. Information is not homogeneous. In that case, what we found in this case study that the best information source was punctual source information analysis. This generated a learned lesson. Through this exercise, we analyzed certain recommendations to entrepreneurs to verify and have documents of information on all the productive sector, the whole productive process, unitary operations that generate particle emissions. In that case, in the study case, we developed two scenarios. If I have a baseline, which is practically the national brick-making inventory developed by KM in 2015, and updated information up to 2018 in that moment, 2018, 2019, emissions in that mining park. What happens if we improve energetic conditions, combustion specifically, where the environmental authorities take measures? And what happens if they improve operational conditions of the productive brick making process by reducing or having better operational practices, reducing reprocess, for example? In those conditions, in those two scenarios, let's say the most critical scenario was found for PM 2.5, the highest concentration of 25 microns PM 2.5 were located in the brick makers that are southwards in the Mochuelo mining park. In modeling the reduction of emissions from the energetic advantage or better technological practices in order to avoid reprocessing production, this area was reduced above 25 microns in 24 hours. That's the average condition. Same for sulfur dioxide. Having the possibility of analyzing this emission, keeping in mind that sulfur dioxide, which has sulfur and it is a key component in the fuels used in this brick-making sector, this is a precursor of formation of PM 2.5. So we viewed that if I consumed a high amount of fuel, coal, what happens in better advantage of energetic power? I could have a reduction in fuel that could generate a reduction of emissions of sulfur dioxide. This gives us, this behavior gives us a map of the behavior of impact zones. Specifically, here I have on the right the analysis compared to the Mochuelo Bajo village. And the high area, this is San Joaquin neighborhood and other areas in that zone. So, if I have the possibility to generate data in order to understand public health data, I have raw material in order to improve effects in the long run. At least in this exercise that we developed, emissions were reduced in 18.5%. through a conservative scenario of fuel consumption reduction or best practices that reduce reprocesses in my productive activity. It has practically, in proportion, it has 18% reduction of emissions of PM 2.5 and sulfur dioxide by improving the ability of or the amount of fuel I use, or 23% in implementing best productive practices that avoid reprocesses. This has environmental effects also, certain benefits from the environmental approach. Reduction in the use of fuels, reduction of emissions that have direct and indirect effects. Economic effects associated to production improvement and less fuel consumed per batch of brick produced. And it presents certain social effects. This direct activity practically exercise good effects in the study area. So, in this case, the modeling work stays only to know an exposure analysis, direct pollutant exposure. Perfectly, this information could be a raw material for decision making at public policy level. If I have in my spot, I have what happens in environmental effects happening in my cooking process, for example, by better use of natural resources, by reducing external activities, external economic pressures associated to the poor air quality, and likewise financial management of that process of pollution. Whether I need to have a technical management, legal management, and economic management of that brick making company, social management of that pollution. In that case, we can generate other model at a regional or national level. And what we have found is that if I keep in mind the features, morbidity, mortality characteristics I could have due to those exposed areas to hazardous situations in public health, I can have the opportunity of modeling, analyzing what would happen if I improve my emissions in the brick making productive sector, in that economic sector. This could be managed for the whole sector. Through the LEAP tool, you can have this prospective scenarios analysis, keeping in mind direct information, the measures given me by KM, given to me and they were made in several parts of Colombia to understand PM 2.5, black carbon, and sulfur dioxide. And with this information, we present the raw material for public policies, including heterogeneous stakeholders in the public and private sector. This goes beyond to physicochemical composition. We go to the analysis to guarantee, for example, all of the stakeholders involved in this sector, in this industrial economic sector, could be or could have benefits of these best practices, independently of their size. And this is the study case we developed in modeling air quality under the same conditions I told you. Dispersion models to analyze what happens in air pollution up to analysis per sector about what could be the action ways through modeling the benefits in public health. Thank you very much. Thank you, Engineer David, for your kind presentation and context. For us, it's really important, your presentation. And you described the work we have done in KM in those regards. Next, we have a special guest from Medellin City, Engineer Sara Grisales. She's expert in short life pollutants for the Clean Air Coalition, and she's gonna make a presentation on the two modeling tools to implement measures in air quality improvement, the commitment of Colombia before climate change. Good morning, Engineer Zara. Thank you for being with us today. We welcome you, so you tell us your experiences.
Muchas gracias, Fabio.
Thank you, Fabio.
Voy a compartir
I'm gonna
pantalla.
share my screen.
¿Pueden ver mi pantalla?
You see my screen, right?
Ok, perfecto. Entonces, buenos días para todos.
Okay, good morning.
Mi nombre es Sara
My name is
Grisales.
Sara
Soy
Grisales.
magíster en
I'm
ingeniería
master's
ambiental de la
in
Universidad
environmental
Antioquia
engineering,
y
and
voy a presentarles, como
I'm
mencionó
going to
previamente
introduce,
Fabio,
as previously mentioned,
algunas experiencias
certain
referentes a
experiences
herramientas de
related
modelación para
to
la
modeling
inclusión de
tools
medidas
for
enfocadas a
implementing
mejorar la
public
calidad del
policies to
aire
improve
en los
air
compromisos de
quality
Colombia frente al
according
cambio
to the
climático.
commitments of Colombia before climate change. Colombia has developed the national strategy of climate short life pollutants, which has the main goal of making actions to reduce emissions of short life pollutants, which are substances or components, likewise the greenhouse effect gases. Moreover, they stay in the atmosphere during a short life and they affect air quality and have adverse effects in the health of humans and animals. In this strategy, they mention several pollutants: methane, hydroxyfluorocarbons, tropospheric ozone, and we made special emphasis in black carbon. These are the efforts where we have focused in this update of the activities in Colombia. In order to have estimation of emissions, we have a focus based on several methods. It is an international method where we need information about activity developed in the sector where we're going to assess. Maybe this is on inventories for that sector or information collected or compiled on previous activities, production, fuel consumption, energy consumption, electricity consumption. Moreover, we need emission factors, international or local ones, as it was done in a former presentation, where they presented that for the brick-making sector, we don't only have the national inventory of that sector that contains production for year 2015, type of kilns used, type of fuels used. Moreover, KM has carried on certain efforts supported by the Clean Air Coalition in order to estimate local factors where we have observed the relevance of those because they could be internationally used. And you take a risk that is overestimate. In this case of those emissions. That's why it is important to have local emission factors. If they are not present there, they can be found in the international website of the environmental company. We have a last version 2019, and with that information, they use the LEAP tool, Low Emissions Analysis Platform, which is a tool to analyze energetic policies and mitigation of climate change, based on a format established with several scenarios in order to assess the impacts of several mitigation measures. So, as I told you before, it is important to have a baseline information in order to make an estimation, an estimate. We don't speak about activities in general in that sector, but also it is important to have efforts in, for instance, in national inventories of pollutants or substances that want to be assessed, to have these values as a reference, as a baseline, in order to compare projections in the future. So, for instance, in Colombia, we have developed the national inventory of short-life pollutants, atmosphere short-life pollutants, and black carbon. And this is a very important instrument in the process of managing air quality and decision making, because this is the starting point to the implementation, assessment, or assessed. And we noticed the real improvement in air quality. Since we started in 2014, we estimated a total of black carbon emissions. Specifically, I have interest in that pollutant. Out of 21,000 tons, they are distributed for several sectors, whereby for the industry, it could be the big sector. We need to analyze sectors, and we can evidence what are the sources of pollutants and where to put risks, the focus of risks, in order to reduce emissions. So we have several sectors that contribute differently in emissions of black carbon. Nevertheless, for that exercise of modeling, no forest or grass areas were not included, because it is difficult to analyze these emissions and other activities related to them. So it was decided to make the approach, the focus, without including those, to see how in 2014 or 2015 have a reference point. For assessing projections, we used two approaches. Approach one is related to the co-benefits in black carbon from the efforts in reducing greenhouse effect gases. So these commitments that were already in place, that were already associated to the climate change production, it was how this is a finished work, and this could contribute to elimination formats. You can evaluate what is included or not in structural gas effect. The result then compare these 15,000 tons mitigation of black carbon, reduction of 2,000 tons approximately, compared the baseline. Thank you. This is the assessment of the measures adopted in Colombia to reduce climate change. Now, when we assess the second approach, which is measurements required special differential treatment because of level, detail level or potential of affectation in terms of black carbon emissions, we assessed these 6 measures, where the ones we have here, implementation of efficient wood working stoves, working in brickmaking companies. These are all included in commitments of greenhouse effect reduction. And we decided that we needed a detailed focus in the emissions of these new stakeholders in order to assess several methods how this could affect final estimations. And as totally additional measures in greenhouse effect reduction, we have the implementation of standards Euro 6, Euro 5 for implementing new diesel buses and reduction of 20% claiming for 2030. These measures have political and technical feasibility. We have studied their influence. That's why we decided to include them as the additional framework. All this information included with availability in Colombia, we had a result that in the mitigation scenario of greenhouse effects gases plus additional measures, those belonging to additional sector, this totally reduced of 30% of black carbon in 2030 compared to these 15,000 tons. Nevertheless, this is the result of modeling exercise that we carried on, and it is subject to political feasibility if it is possible to increase those ambitions. And as a Colombian commitment before the Paris Agreement in updating NBC, we decided a reduction of 40% in 2030. Remember that this is without including forest and greenhouse burning. We not only want to do an estimate in black carbon and that ambition, this not only is going to help us with our commitments before climate change, but also this is going to improve air quality. Also, we can assess co-benefits in reducing other pollutants, for example, organic carbon, particulate materials, amongst others. Together with the Ministry, I opened a new page and we're going to present morbidity and mortality associated to the impact in air quality, in which this modeling exercise is going to give us an estimate and projections of concentration 2.5 for Colombia. So, as final messages, takeaway messages, this exercise reflects the results of the co-benefits of the measures implemented already established in NDC and others that have political and technical feasibility. Not necessarily they are focusing reducing greenhouse effect gases, but improving air quality in general. And it is important to keep in mind that in order to carry on this type of exercises, the baseline information is really important. So, having an update or generate an inventory of pollutants that you want to assess, in this case, black carbon, this could be articulated to the already defined comments. In our case, in the national system of MRD, where the idea is to articulate in order as it is updated the information on greenhouse effects, black carbon is going to update it too to see their behavior and how they vary in emissions as we continue doing our measurements and how the sources continue. It is of great importance to improve efforts in order to estimate local emissions. As previously mentioned, this could reduce overestimations or subestimations of emissions. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your kind invitation. These are my contact details, and if there's any question, please let me know. Thank you, Sara, for your kind presentation. If you have any questions or inquiries, please leave them in the chat. in the chat box. And through this tool, we're going to give you solutions, or we hope to use your response. And we thank all of the people present today. We have around 60% of people. Thank you. Greetings to the people supporting us in Quindío, Medellin, Bogota, areas in Colombia, and other countries such as Asia, Nepal, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Let's hope they are with us today. Next, I pass the floor to a very special guest of the University of York, England. He is Chris Malley.
Thank you very much. Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's really nice to be here and to participate in this webinar. I would like to talk about how air pollution benefits of climate change mitigation strategies can be evaluated using a tool that is developed at SEI called the Low Emission Analysis Platform, or LEAP, that Sarah gave in her last presentation. But before I talk about how LEAP has been used and highlight a specific example of Bangladesh, I'd like to start looking at a global perspective. In the previous two presentations, we've heard about how specific mitigation actions in the brick sector or on black carbon can be integrated into national policies. I'd like to start by talking about how global opportunities to achieve climate change and air pollution benefits, how we can downscale those to identify national actions that can be taken. So rather than thinking bottom up from particular actions in the brick sector, how can we think about what the global opportunity is and break it down to understand how that can be implemented at the national scale? So what is that global opportunity? This graph here comes from a paper that was published by the European Commission Joint Research Centre in 2018. This graph shows the avoided health benefits from air pollution exposure that would be achieved for different climate change mitigation scenarios. So it looks to 2050 and estimates that if countries implemented their nationally determined contributions, globally, we could avoid 300,000 premature deaths per year from the air pollution reductions that are achieved at the same time as the greenhouse gas emission reductions. But if we increase our climate change mitigation ambition, if globally we take action to keep temperatures below 2 degrees, then we can more than double that health benefit. We can avoid over 1 million premature deaths per year by 2050 if we achieve the Paris Agreement target. So there is a huge opportunity globally to improve public health through climate change mitigation actions and the air pollution that they reduce. And I don't need to spend long on this slide. We know that the pollutants that have the effect on climate and have the effect on air pollution, the short-lived climate pollutants. And crucially, we know the specific actions that, if implemented globally, would lead to these health benefits as well as mitigating climate change. So we've talked about brick kilns, but within the residential sector, within the transport sector and agriculture, there are a large number of actions that can be taken to reduce the emissions of black carbon and other air pollutants. Within agriculture, oil and gas waste management, there are also a range of actions that can reduce methane, which forms tropospheric ozone and has an effect on respiratory health. We can also reduce other short-lived climate pollutants like HFCs through action in the air conditioning sector. As I'm sure most of you on the call know, these emission reductions of short-lived climate pollutants have multiple benefits: avoiding 0.5 degrees of climate warming by 2050, huge benefits from human health, from reducing outdoor and household air pollution, and having benefits for food security by avoiding agricultural crop yield losses due to plants' exposure to ozone air pollution. So there are lots of advantages to working nationally to identify those strategies that have air pollution and climate change benefits. We have common sources of both greenhouse gases and air pollutants in the transport sector, the energy sector, industry, agriculture, waste. And we have these short-lived climate pollutants, or SLCPs, that directly contribute to both impacts. We can also minimize the trade-offs, minimize any increase in air pollutant emissions from climate change actions, and maximize the multiple benefits by taking into account the health benefits from climate change action. The work that I'm going to present today has been undertaken as part of the national planning initiative of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. Within the national planning, or the SNAP initiative, we try and provide technical support to countries to increase the action that they take on reducing short-lived climate pollutants. So this includes holding workshops, providing tools and guidance like the LEAP tool, so that national planners can effectively identify and prioritize the mitigation measures that have the largest benefit for climate change mitigation and the largest benefit for health. There are approximately 25 to 30 countries working as part of the SNAP initiative across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And there's different level of support that have been provided depending on national circumstances and the specific actions that are the priority for the government in each country. One of the key things that has been the output from the work in the SNAP initiative have been the development of national plans and strategies to reduce short-lived climate pollutants or to improve air pollution. And the key thing that these plans and strategies do is to take that global picture, in terms of the mitigation actions that can achieve the largest benefit for health and for climate change, and place them in a national context. The emission sources in different countries are not all the same, and the contribution that they make to air pollution, health impacts, and to climate change also differs. So it's our goal to provide tools that allow national planners to identify, based on their national context, what the major emission sources are and what mitigation actions can be taken that have the largest benefits for climate change and for health. So to provide a couple of examples of the work that the SNAP initiative has supported, and I want to emphasize that this is not my work, this is the work of the planners and people in this case, the Maldives, that they have done. I'm just highlighting it here because I think it highlights good examples. So I mentioned translating these global mitigation actions and priorities to the national scale. The Maldives is perhaps the best example of a country where the emission sources are very nationally specific. The Maldives is a country with about 300,000 people, made up of over 1,000 islands in Asia. the actions that they included in the National Action Plan on Air Pollution try and target the major sources of air pollutants in the Maldives, which include land transport, motorcycles and vehicles in their crowded capital city, as well as marine vehicles, the diesel engines that are used on the boats in the Maldives. And what's important to highlight about the analysis that was done in the Maldives is that compared to the baseline scenario, which is shown in yellow on the central graph, implementing their nationally determined contribution, implementing their climate change plan could reduce the emissions of fine particulate matter, PM2.5, by 35% in 2030. And that's really important and something that I'm going to come back to as I go through this presentation. In many cases, the climate change commitments that countries have made, their nationally determined contributions, do not take into account air pollutants. They have not been developed to reduce air pollutant emissions. But we see here, despite not having been developed for that purpose, there is a substantial benefit, a substantial reduction in air pollutant emissions that can be achieved through the implementation of their climate change commitment. This provides a basis to then identify what additional actions can be taken to reduce air pollutant emissions. In the Maldives, there were 6 additional actions that were identified that could further reduce emissions of air pollutants by 25%. So this combination of identifying the co-benefits for climate change mitigation measures and then the additional actions that can be achieved on top of that to improve air quality is something that has been commonly developed within the National Planning Initiative of the CCAC. And then some of the things that this has led to in the SNAP initiative is the integration of SLCPs in climate change planning. And this slide highlights the commitment that Mexico made to reduce black carbon emissions by 51% in 2030 compared to a baseline scenario. However, we also now have the excellent example for Colombia with a 40% reduction compared to 2014 levels, which I would say is the most ambitious target to reduce black carbon in any climate change commitment. So we're seeing more and more countries make these type of commitments in their nationally determined contributions. What I want to highlight now, or what I want to talk about, is how can we evaluate these different mitigation priorities? How can we identify the major emission source sectors and evaluate how the implementation of different mitigation measures would reduce our air pollutant emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, and what benefits we could gain by reducing these emissions? And the answer is through the application of this low emissions analysis platform, or LEAP tool, that has been applied and used by national planners in many countries in the SNAP initiative to develop the mitigation assessment and the identification of benefits. So the important thing to highlight about LEAP is a piece of software that can be used to look at energy and non-energy emission sources. And it's designed as a scenario analysis tool. It's designed to be a tool that allows you to develop projections of how emissions might change into the future for different assumptions. And this philosophy of looking at different scenarios and evaluating how they differ in terms of emissions allows you to look at the implementation of different policies and measures and how the future, where those policies and measures are implemented, might be different compared to one where we don't have those regulations or policies or laws or incentives to adopt lower emitting behavior. So it's designed to be a scenario analysis tool and to compare different scenarios. The other two important things to highlight is LEAP is not a model itself. It's a tool for creating a model. This is important. It raises an important point about the ownership of the analysis that is done to identify these priorities. There is nothing within the LEAP software that is predetermined by the Stockholm Environment Institute, or who I work for, or anybody else. It is down to the user of LEAP to develop the modeling framework and to identify the data that is needed and to enter it into the model. As Sarah knows, that can be a long and hard process to build an analysis. But it's the intention for LEAP to be used by national planners, not for an organization like SEI to do the analysis ourselves, but to have national ownership over these analyses so that it can reflect national priorities and so that it can be updated over time as new information becomes available or as national priorities change. And that's why the work that I'm presenting here is not work that SEI has done, but work that has been done by our partners in ministries of environment or environmental protection agencies or other organizations in the countries where we are supporting work. I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about the technical details of LEAP. This graph here shows the structure of a LEAP analysis. There are three key things that I would like to highlight. The first thing I want to highlight are the two boxes at the top called demographics and macroeconomics. These are the external variables which we enter into a LEAP model to drive projections into the future. So these are the variables that we use to create our projection of emissions. So often variables like GDP, value added of different sectors, population growth, etc., are those variables which we grow into the future. The second thing that I want to highlight are the two boxes underneath called demand and transformation analysis. This is our energy sector modeling. The energy sector is often the largest source of emissions in a country. It includes manufacturing industries, including brick kilns, but also transport, the residential sector, electricity generation. And we can model the emissions in each of those sectors. But the important thing here is that the demand for energy and the transformation, the supply of energy, are linked together. And that is very useful when it comes to looking at future scenarios. So if we think about a mitigation action that we might want to take, let's, if we pick, for example, the transport sector and the switch to a larger number of electric vehicles in the vehicle fleet. As we increase the number of electric vehicles, we are going to increase the demand for electricity to power those vehicles. In LEAP, because the energy demand and the energy supply in the transformation analysis are linked, that feedback, that increase in electricity demand from having a larger number of electric vehicles is built into the modeling framework. And we can therefore assess the overall change in emissions from that electric vehicle policy. We can assess the reduction in tailpipe or exhaust emissions from having more electric vehicles. And we can assess the extent to which that reduction in emissions is offset by increased emissions from electricity generation. So I think that's very important because it is fundamental to model those links to be able to understand what level of emission reductions can be achieved from many climate change and air pollution policies. And then the third thing that I want to highlight from the modeling is the link to the environmental loadings, that's their name in LEAP, but pollutant emissions, and then the link to impacts in the IBC, or Integrated Benefits Calculator. And it's in the IBC where we take the emissions of different pollutants and convert them into estimates of air pollution exposure, premature mortality, and impacts on climate through temperature change. In order to undertake this type of analysis, we require some key input data. Often this data has already been collected in greenhouse gas emission inventories, but things like energy balances or energy surveys, which characterize how much fuel is consumed from different processes and sectors, is really important. Then, to create our future scenarios, knowing what plans and policies are in place for climate, energy, and air pollution is really key and important. And then I just want to highlight here that as well as understanding the emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases and their impacts on health and climate, there are a range of other outputs that we can evaluate. This includes the cost of implementing different mitigation actions, how much we're using natural resources, our energy security indicators. So we can get a broader view of the impact of implementing these plans beyond just the air pollutant emissions. LEAP is also designed to be relatively user-friendly. So you can easily get a graph of the data that you're entering of your output and of your outputs. And you can export that into PowerPoint or Microsoft Word, so it's quite easy to interact with and to enter data. I want to just focus for a moment on the methodology for how we take those emissions from LEAP and convert them into air pollution concentrations and health impacts. This is done in a relatively simple way, and the reason for that is that we want to make it relatively quick to be able to evaluate multiple different scenarios in terms of their likely impact on air pollution exposure and on human health. So it's not the intention or the functionality of LEAP IBC to be able to do very detailed assessments of the spatial distribution of air pollutants, as we saw from the previous presentation. It aims to give a quick and relatively robust assessment of the change in air pollution concentrations and the possible health benefits from that change of exposure, but not to be the sort of most detailed type of modeling that it's possible to do in this area. To give that quick assessment of the impact of these emissions on air pollution exposure, the emissions of particular pollutants are combined with the output from an atmospheric chemistry transport model. They're combined with the output from an atmospheric chemistry transport model called GeosChem. This model takes into account the transport and chemical reactions of pollutants in the atmosphere and estimates what the national population-weighted annual PM2.5 concentration is from that exposure. We then combine that PM2.5 concentration for different scenarios with the impacts on, with concentration response functions that quantify the impacts on health, on premature mortality for adults and children, for respiratory, cardiovascular diseases, and lung cancer. So I want to finish by giving an example of how that modeling framework, how this modeling framework of estimating emissions and estimating health benefits was applied in the development of the National Action Plan to reduce short-lived climate pollutants in Bangladesh. Bangladesh was a founding member of the CCAC and has been involved in the SNAP initiative on national planning since 2013. It was one of the first 4 countries alongside Colombia that was involved in the National SLCP planning initiative since it started. They were interested in evaluating the local air quality benefits from their climate change commitment. And this evaluation of local benefits from their climate change commitment led to the development of this National Action Plan to reduce short-lived climate pollutants that was endorsed in 2018. The development of the LEAP analysis in Bangladesh followed a similar process to what Sarah described in Colombia and what we usually do when developing these type of analyses. There are 3 main stages. The first is the development of the historical emission inventory to understand the level of emissions historically and how it and what contribution different sectors have made to the emissions. They were then projected into the future for a baseline scenario, and we then evaluated different mitigation scenarios. We evaluated different mitigation scenarios that represent the implementation of different policies and measures. So this is the first step. We obtained as much local information, or our colleagues at the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology, BUIT, obtained as much local information as possible on energy consumption in different sectors, on livestock sector, and the waste sector, to estimate the emissions of different short-lived climate pollutants like black carbon on the left and methane, different air pollutants and greenhouse gases in Bangladesh. You can see, the major contribution of black carbon emissions in Bangladesh comes from the residential sector, but there's also substantial contributions from manufacturing and construction, which includes the brick sector, and from the services sector. And one of the features of LEAP is that it allows you to reflect local emission sources that are not necessarily picked up in international emission inventory guidance and things like that. In Bangladesh, rice parboiling, the boiling of rice using the rice husks as the fuel, is a very large source of black carbon emissions that is incorporated here under the services sector, but is not taken into account in international emission inventory guidance. But we can build it into the LEAP model because there's nothing that's fixed or prescriptive about it. We then created the baseline projection and evaluated these 15 or so mitigation actions. We included mitigation actions that are in the nationally determined contribution, the climate change commitment that Bangladesh made in 2015. These actions include actions that are in place, that are being implemented in Bangladesh, additional actions, and then possible actions that could be taken to further reduce emissions. The important thing here is the specificity of the mitigation actions that allows them to be implemented in LEAP. one of the important things here is that they need to have a specific target and a timeline for their implementation. So it's not sufficient to say that we want to have more people cooking with improved biomass cook stoves. We need to say that we need 1.5 million improved cook stoves in place by 2015 in order to be able to reflect this in LEAP. So it can also help to sharpen the specificity of mitigation actions by defining them in a way that allows them to, their mitigation potential to be quantified. Having identified those mitigation priorities, we were then able to evaluate the effect that they have on emissions of these key pollutants. So each bar on this bar chart shows a different scenario. The emissions in 2010 are shown on the left, and the implementation of all of the mitigation actions is shown in the far right bar on each panel. What we can see is that compared to the 2030 baseline, the second column from the left, implementing all these actions in the NDC and in the additional SLCP actions would lead to substantial reductions, about a 60%, about 50% reduction, sorry, in black carbon emissions and a 40% reduction in methane emissions compared to the baseline scenario. We saw in the example for the Maldives how climate change mitigation actions can also have air pollution benefits. And we see that here. Implementing all of the actions in Bangladesh's NDC would reduce black carbon emissions substantially, reduce NOx emissions substantially compared to the 2030 baseline. But the other thing that this analysis in Bangladesh tells us is that implementing the actions that target short-lived climate pollutants, that target air pollutants, can also further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In the bottom left panel, you can see for the SLCP scenario where we're taking actions targeting black carbon, we get a further reduction in CO2 emissions. So taking these actions on air pollution and on SLCPs can further enhance our climate change mitigation ambition as well, which is, I think, is important when we're thinking in the context of how countries can achieve climate change mitigation strategies that are consistent with the Paris Agreement. This is one way of doing it that maximizes local benefits for air pollution at the same time. And then the final thing that I want to present is what impacts these different scenarios will have. These graphs here show on the left-hand side the population-weighted annual average PM2.5 concentration in 2010, and then in 2030 for a baseline and mitigation scenarios. We can see that implementing the mitigation scenario, all of those actions, NDC and air pollutants, would lead to a substantial reduction in the PM2.5 concentrations in Bangladesh. But we can also see that a substantial fraction of that PM2.5 concentration in Bangladesh comes from regional transport of emissions, not from national emissions in Bangladesh. So really we need regional action in order to be able to reduce the air pollutant emissions in Bangladesh further. That reduction in air pollutant emissions, in outdoor air pollutant emissions, is estimated to reduce 12,000 premature deaths per year in 2030. But we can also see for the far right plot that we can achieve even larger reductions in premature deaths from household air pollution by taking action to reduce exposure to, by taking action that reduces exposure of people to household air pollutant emissions by switching to LPG or to more efficient biomass stoves for cooking. So we can assess both the outdoor and the household air pollution impacts of these different mitigation strategies. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for your presentation. Muchas gracias por la presentación, Chris.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. Now we want to thank Chris and all the people present with us today. We have invited people from Brazil, coffee growing area, and Medellin in Colombia. Pass the floor to Santiago Gomez, expert engineering environment with wide experience in environment for mining and atmosphere pollution, noise pollution, and advanced modeling. Santiago, thank you for being with us today. We're having your presentation here, so you tell us your experience.
Adelante, Javier. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Perfecto, sí, señor.
Ok, buenos días para todos.
Good morning,
Muchas
you
gracias,
all.
Caem, por la
Thank you,
invitación.
Caem, for your kind
La
invitation.
siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Vamos a hablar
We're
del
going to
tema de
talk
calidad de
about
aire
air
y
quality
cómo,
and
desde el dato de calidad
how,
de aire y los efectos
with
de
this
modificación
data
climática,
and modeling,
tomar decisiones
we
de
can
política
make
pública
decisions
sobre
in public
temas de
policies
contaminación
related
atmosférica.
to atmosphere
La
pollution.
siguiente, por favor. Vamos primero a
First,
definir un
we're going to
objetivo de esta
define the
breve
goals
charla
of
de 20
this talk,
minutos.
20 minutes.
Después vamos a hacer
Then
una
after, we're going to have a
diferenciación en los
difference
conceptos
in
de
concepts
los datos de
of
calidad de
data
aire.
in air
Es muy
quality.
importante
It
entender
is
que los
important
datos de calidad de aire
to have this
involucran
data.
y tienen en sí
These
mismos una
involve
serie de información
in
que hay que saber
themselves a
diferenciar.
series of
Yo quiero
information we need to
enfatizar
differentiate.
básicamente en la definición de
Basically,
los datos
we need to
mismos,
have a difference
lo que es el
between data,
background,
the
algunos tipos de
background
background,
data,
y lo que
and
es la
what
contribución. Ya en
is
la primera
contribution.
presentación,
From the first
habló un
presentation,
poco acerca
David talked
de las
about
contribuciones desde el
what would
modelo.
be
Yo
the
quiero enfatizar
contribution
en
in the
eso.
model, with the
Regresamos
model.
a la anterior, por favor. Vamos a hablar de
We're going to talk
unos conceptos
about
preliminares de modelos de
preliminary
dispersión,
concepts
modelos
of
de calidad de
dispersion
aire,
models,
para que
air
todos tengamos
quality
como el mismo
models.
lenguaje. Y después voy a
And then
mostrar
after,
4
I'm going to
casos
show 4
orientados
case
hacia las
studies
tomas de decisiones
associated to
en términos
decision
de
making and
política
public policy
pública
making
y actuación privada
and
puede
private
aportar los modelos.
activities focusing these
Y
models.
quiero cerrar esta
And I want to
presentación
close
de
this
manera muy
presentation
breve con unos
with
tips
certain
que
tips,
van a explicar, que
advices
van
that
a
are going to
concluir en relación con todo esto que
conclude
hemos visto antes,
in
de
relation
cómo
to what we have
esos datos
studied,
de calidad de aire
how
pueden
all this
convertirse,
air
de
quality
evaluaciones de
data
calidad de
could
aire pueden
turn
convertirse
into
en
models,
inputs
could be
para
input for modeling,
política pública
for
y
public
además
policy
para la
making
toma de decisión del sector
and decision
privado.
making from the private sector.
Siguiente, por favor. Los objetivos que he
The
trazado para
goals
esta
I have
presentación
presented
son
in
los
this
siguientes.
presentation
Lo
are as
primero es entender
follows.
un
First,
poco
we
las
need to
mediciones de calidad de aire
understand the
basadas en
measurements
análisis integral
based in
con una
integral
fuente meteorológica y las
analysis
fuentes con una medición
meteorologically
específica.
in a specific source.
Lo segundo es entender
Second
un poco
is
la capacidad
understand
que tiene un modelo y
the
los
ability or
resultados que ese
capacity of a
modelado
model. What is
esos que
modeling?
están involucrados,
What data are involved?
por qué la
Why
simulación puede ser realmente una
modeling
muy
could be a
utilidad en
very
esto.
useful tool for this.
Lo otro que quiero es que
Next,
entendamos que
we
existe la
need to
posibilidad de
understand there's the
relacionar los
possibility
resultados
to
del modelo
relate
con
the results of a model
políticas y escenarios de
with
política pública y
public
actuaciones
policies
privadas.
and private
Y
activities
por
and
último, después de haber
results.
dado respuesta a
And
los 3
after
puntos
giving
anteriores,
answer
creo
to
que
the
es
former
más
3
que
points,
lógico
it is
pensar
more than
que el
logical
uso
to
del
think
modelo
that the
puede
use
ser
of a model
una
could
herramienta
be a
fundamental
fundamental tool
para entender
to
el fenómeno
understand the
de calidad de
phenomenon of
aire
air
y
quality
definir estrategias de
and define
mitigación.
strategies of
Finalmente, lo que
mitigation.
hemos venido hablando a lo largo de la
Finally,
mañana
what we have
es
talked
de
this
eso, es
morning is
cómo
that
un modelo te da un resultado
how
y cómo ese resultado
we
se puede
obtain
traducir en
results with
escenarios
a model, and
y
with
cómo
those
esos escenarios
scenarios,
pueden conducir a
this
una
could lead
mejora no
to
solo en
an
temas de calidad
improvement,
de
not
aire
only
o
in air
cambio
quality
climático, sino
or
que,
climate
como
change,
han mostrado los
but
demás
also in health,
panelistas,
as shown
efectos
by the
básicos
rest
en
of
salud
speakers,
y
basic
cómo eso
effects in
puede ser
health,
entendido
and how
como
this could be
mejora o
understood
implementación de políticas
as
particulares, tal y como
improvement
está en el documento de presentación de esta
by
sesión.
particular private actions together with
La
public
siguiente, por
actions.
favor. Este es el primer punto
The
importante
first
es el tema de las
idea
mediciones de
is
calidad de aire,
measurement of air
en
quality
términos de salud, en
in
términos de
terms of
seguridad, en
health,
términos de
monitoring,
intención de las
intention of
autoridades y todos los
authorities,
agentes que
and
tienen
all
que
of
ver con
the
emisiones, es digamos que el
stakeholders
primer punto.
related to emissions.
Una medición de calidad de aire
An
no
air
es
quality
mala si
emission
hay
is not good or bad.
estándares
There are
internacionales
international standards
para
to make certain measurements in air quality, PM10, PM2.5, sulfur, nitrogen, ozone, other substances, short life pollutants. But the first question we need to make is, what is what we are measuring when we measure air quality? There are certain images, 4 images on the left in your screens, that show several pollutant sources. When you measure air quality, you need to understand that you're measuring sources with several participations, several proportions, pollutants that due to their nature travel more or less in an atmosphere. Moreover, you can measure pollutants, primary ones or secondary ones, in the case of ozone, for example. So there's no good or bad measures. When you have a measurement in air quality and this has a number, we all are going to check that number and compare to standard of air quality. But we need to understand what is our measurement, what we are measuring. And this group of sources, this source participation, after Nestor and Miriam are going to explain the details on how receiver measurements can explain the patterns. This gives us representatives on sampling. These are two sources in the center. To the left of the vehicle, you see a particular conventional source close to a way. What they are measuring is mainly the punctual area. And in the lower part, there's a series of equipment in an open air field. It is located higher related to the sea level. This you have a different measure. What do I mean with this? Depending on the position of equipment you use to measure, depending on the presence or non presence of the source, you can estimate their quality. And that phenomenon could be seen in 3 levels, which is what you have in the right side of your screen. The first level, we're going to call it natural background, understanding that this is a regional transportation, PM2.5 in presence of PM10. There are contributions of other sources of analysis. In the first presentation, David established that the brick-making sector is close to the Doña Juana sanitary filling, and of course, this is what we call other sources. And lastly, we have other sources that you are analyzing. They are the object of your study. Below those 3 scales, you have the image of a valley in Antioquia, and you have the windrows where there's a river, and you have a high area. These 2 windroses have 2 directions. The first one is northwest to southeast. In the top part of the mountain, winds have east to west direction and west to east direction. In other words, according to topography and the movement of wind, as shown in the first presentation, they're going to show where to and where from the pollution goes or stays, or where the pollution comes from. When you measure air quality, you have to pay special attention in quality, availability of electricity, energy, quality control, and what is the type of monitoring I require. Real-time, passive monitoring, or longer cycle monitoring, depending on the pollutant or the phenomenon I want to analyze. Now, air quality measures many things. Models give me sources I want to assess. In that, several models, Gaussian, Lagrangian, Eulerian
De acuerdo
models.
con los problemas, la
And
escala de
according to
análisis, los
problems,
contaminantes,
analysis scale,
tienes que tomar
pollutants,
decisiones
you
de
need
qué
to make
modelo
decisions
emplear.
on what model are
En
you
escalas
going to
locales, los
use.
modelos gaussianos son
Locally,
muy comunes. En
Gaussian
escalas
models
regionales de mayor
are good.
dimensión,
In
podrías tener
regional,
modelos de tipo lagrangiano.
you can
Colombia en
use
particular,
Lagrangian models.
en ausencia de una
Colombia,
guía de modelación
in
propia,
absence of a
recurre a la guía de modelación de la
proper
EPA,
guideline,
que está actualizada desde el
they use
2017.
EPA
Y esa
guidelines.
guía tiene
And these
ERMO como
guidelines
modelo preferido,
use the
efectivamente preferido
Gaussian
del Código
as
de
preferred
Transferencia de los
model
Estados Unidos.
according to the federal
Este tipo de
regulations
modelos
of the
además
United
nos
States,
permiten
and
hacer cálculos
they
de
have
Malley, de CIMAC, de
calculs, CIMAC, or
Lo
other
que vamos a ver
models.
a continuación es
What we're
aplicación
going
de
to
ERMO
see
como modelo
is
preferido.
the preferred model
Y el
application.
mensaje
And
retoma lo que dijeron al comienzo
the
de esta
message is,
actividad.
as said at the beginning of this activity,
Depende de la
this
condición,
depends
tú
on the
tienes que seleccionar un
condition.
modelo que
You need
interprete de
to
la
select
mejor
a
manera el
model
fenómeno
that
que estás haciendo. El modelo es
understand the
simplemente
best
una
way the
herramienta
model. The model is
y esa
just a tool.
herramienta hay que entenderla como una
The
herramienta
tool
que debe
needs
ser
to
lo
be
más
understood
completa
that
posible
is
para la
should be
interpretación
as
de una
thought of
realidad.
as possible
Y
to
esa
understand
realidad
a
es el
reality,
fenómeno de
and the
contaminación que hay
reality
en
is
ese
air
modelo.
pollution that we want to
La
assess.
siguiente, por favor. Quiero aquí
Here,
enfatizar en
I
los
want to
elementos del modelo para
emphasize
entender
the elements of
cómo
a
el
model
modelo va a permitir
to
evaluar
understand
resultados.
how the model is going to give us
Puedes modelar
results.
PM10, PM2.5,
You
azufre,
can
nitrógeno,
assess
ozono,
sulfur,
flúor,
nitrogen, ozone,
orgánicos persistentes,
PM2.5, nitrogen,
cualquier
etc.
cantidad de
You can
cosas,
assess
cualquier
many
contaminante que
things,
se
many
comporte en el
pollutants
aire
that
como el
behave in
aire
the
mismo, es
air
decir, queda
as the air
suspendido.
itself. It is suspended in air.
Un modelo de estas características es capaz de
A
darte
model of these
resoluciones
features can give you
temporales de estos
resolutions,
resultados
temporary
que van
results.
desde concentraciones horarias,
It
pasando
gives
por
us
concentraciones de 2
hourly
horas, cada 3, cada
concentration every
6,
2
cada
hours, every
12
6,
horas,
12
puede
hours,
ser
as you wish,
diarios y
daily
anuales o
and yearly
interanuales
or
incluso. Los
interannual.
interanuales son especialmente importantes cuando tienes estándares de
Interannual
largo
are important
plazo,
for
en el
standards
caso del
long
material
term in the long
particulado,
term,
o estándares
in
de
particular
componentes
materials or
diarios para cierto tipo de redundancia.
timely, hourly
La escala
analysis
también es
for
bien
certain
importante
short
aquí.
life
La EPA
pollutants.
dice que en terrenos
EPA
planos,
states that in
sin
flatlands without
temas de
mountains,
variaciones de viento,
without
dice que el ERMO puede
much
ser hasta
variation of
50
wind,
kilómetros de distancia
up
desde la fuente hasta el
to it is
receptor,
valid
lo que
to
es un
up
número
to
muy
50
grande. Y en
kilometers
nuestra
away from the
topografía
receiver.
colombiana
In
o
our
historia
Colombian
es compleja,
topography
es
or in
bien
complex
difícil.
topography, this
Y
is
cuando
really
uno
difficult.
tiene
And when we have
una
a
fuente compleja, a veces es
complex
mejor pasar de
source,
modelos
it is
gaussianos
better
a
to
otros
pass from the
denominantes más
Gaussian or
altos, como es el
Lagrangian
caso de nuestra geografía en
model,
Colombia.
as the case is
Hay
in the
muchos
Colombian
tipos de modelos. Tú
geography.
puedes
There are
modelar
many sources.
chimeneas,
You can
puedes modelar
model
puntuales, puedes modelar
chimneys,
vías, puedes modelar
you can
planes de
model
área, puedes modelar
roads,
espacios mineros.
ways, mining,
Y es muy importante
and
entender que los
it is
modelos te van a
important that
permitir evaluar los aportes
models
significativos
allow them
puntuales
to assess
o de
focus
grupos de fuentes. Es
sources
decir, tú
or
podrías
groups
definir
of
que una
sources. You
operación
could
en una
define
ladrillera
in
podría
a
decir,
brick
bueno,
making
¿cuánto
company
emiten las vías de la
what is the
ladrillera
emission
respecto
of
a
the
las
waste of the brick
chimeneas del
making
proceso de
company, what
calcinación?
is the
¿Qué
emission of the
tanto pueden
chimneys,
emitirme las operaciones de
how much
remanejo
do
de las
they
cargas?
emit in
Todos esos
reprocessing
grupos te van a
materials.
empezar
And
a
these
entregar
groups are going to
información
show you
en
information
algo que es muy
in
importante. El modelo
something
va a
that is
entregar
really
los
important.
aportes de las fuentes que estén
Government is
involucradas en
going to
ese
contribute
proceso.
with the
¿Cuántas?
contributions
Las que tú
affiliated into the
desees.
system.
Ahora les muestro un caso
How
de
many?
eso que
As you
significa.
wish.
Es muy importante el dato de
It
entrar en
is important
meteorología. Un modelo
to have
básico te va a presentar
methodology.
una topografía,
You
una
take
meteorología y un
methodology,
grupo de fuentes y
methodology,
mezclar
a
todo
group of
eso
sources, and
con unas
mix it
ecuaciones
under
y
certain
entregar un dato de
equations, and they deliver
concentración
a
que
data of
luego comparas entre
concentration
los niveles
that
de
you
control.
compare with the
Vuelvo y repito,
levels
solo para las fuentes que
only
estás
for
modelando.
sources that you are
La
modeling.
meteorología, existen unos
Methodology,
preprocesadores.
there are
Los
certain
modelos son más unos
preprocessors.
paquetes de
They are
modelación que
packages,
procesan
modeling
terreno,
packages. They
meteorología,
process
se entregan, te
terrain,
entregan al final
meteorology, and
un
in the end, they
resultado.
give you a result.
Hay un preprocesador de
There's a
mapeo de ERMO que se llama ERMO para
preprocessor that is called
calibración a
ERME
Calmet,
for Calmet,
etcétera.
etc.
Y
And
obviamente es preferida la
it
información
is
meteorológica local,
methodological, local,
bien obtenida. Y tiene unos
preferred
protocolos y
information.
guías
There are
a nivel
protocols and
internacional qué
guidelines
metodología es
internationally
apropiada
on what
para correr
methodology
tu modelo.
is appropriate to run
Y
the
si no,
model.
puedes utilizar ejercicios de
Otherwise,
reanálisis
you use reanalysis models
para desarrollar la
to
modelación.
develop
Reanálisis de varias
modeling.
maneras. Reanálisis
What
puede
can you
ser con
do
Word,
with the
hay varias opciones.
Word or several sources, several
Y el modelo
softwares?
te entrega una
And the model
concentración en unos
gives you a
llamados receptores,
concentration,
receptores que son discretos, unos específicos
receptors,
o unos mayores
certain
receptores.
specific or grids of
Y es bien
receptors.
importante, el modelo
And it's
solo te
really
va a entregar
important.
resultados
The
de
model is going
mapeo
to give you
desde las
results
fuentes
on
que tú
contribution
estás
from the
modelando.
sources that
Podrías
you
en el
modeled.
fondo
You could include the background, but not necessarily the background is necessary to set it in a model. And the information provided is graphs and numbers. You have three figures. In the upper part, there's a photo of isopleta. It shows a middle yearly concentration. In the middle, you see the representation of the 3D model, the sources of pollution, and the smaller one in the lower left part. What they show is the topography as fundamental element because this is included in the dispersion of analysis. I'm going to explain certain cases. First case analysis is the Cesar mining area in Colombia. It shows the real contribution of pollution derived from mining activities compared to the pollution of other sources in that area. Cesar mining area, as you can see on your right, those mines have certain yellow dots in the chart. Those mines are close to certain towns. During many years, people believed that mines were the main contributors of pollutants and particulate materials to a populated center. And according to modeling, they have demonstrated that it is true the mining activities contribute, but the real source is the populated sector and the public ways. In the bars, you see that the public ways contribute with more than half of the pollution. And operations in a town, in a village, contribute with 22%, and the rest obeys to the mining activity itself. 80% of the pollutions in these populated centers come from the populated center itself and the public ways. What is that for a decision maker? He takes fractions in this. Undoubtedly, they have to take actions on the populated centers that are associated to the mining activity instead of doing specific controls in the mining activity, amongst other situations, because it is much more important to protect the vulnerable population compared to the mining operation itself. So this is a regional analysis that could help us how many contributed with how much, and according to the level of contribution, allowed to make orientation to the graphic energy, the small red, green bars. This is the short contribution of environmental pollutants. I have a regional model. What is the contribution of it? And based on that information, I define how to act and how to lead my actions in an effective manner. This is the analysis of another real case. This is a cement plant. It is in the middle of a valley with winds. It has crosswinds, very strong winds. In conditions of mountain valley, on the right, you have the isopleta. When you have the model of your sources, it is not a regional model, but the source of your sources, the model of your sources. You understand certain things as the ones you find in the slide. The main effects are in the inside of operation. Second, contribution outside the boundaries of operation is in 5 small places for the case of PM10. And in the case you want to establish a monitoring network, you have to locate areas north, east, and winds that go strongly, and they could affect the quality levels of the the example I want to give you is that for you that are a person and you have a source of pollution, the model is effective to tell you where and how you pollute and how do you monitor that source of pollution. This case is a port. This is the current condition in the left. And on the right side of what are the benefits caused by the measures taken. Look at the isopletas are smaller. So when you have decisions on what to control, on how much could control. The model is going to tell you that your affectation stain given by the isopletas could be reduced and what is the proportion of reduction, how to reduce the affectation areas. This is another element for which the model is very useful. And the other analysis is how sources in your model could focus activities of control of pollution. This is a station where you find that the most contributor, 47%, is storing conditions and production plants. In other words, you want to focus your actions. Don't go to the ways or highways. You need to go to the production plant. In this particular case, according to the results of the model, the model is going to allow you, according to the sources groups and how to run the model, this is going to focus the strategies. It's going to tell you if you want to take actions in an effective manner, work in the plants and the accumulation piles. In this particular case, compared to the ways or highways, in this station, in these conditions, in this manufacturing plant, this analysis must be integral. But this is to show how the model allows to define cost-effective strategies. With those cases, let's pass to the next. So, my presentation goes to the inputs for policymakers, decision makers, but private or public officials. With that, with the model, you understand the contributions inequality, who contributes what. Second, you understand, if you have a regional model, you are able to understand the maximum limits of emission, to understand the air quality that is appropriate according to the quality standards. Another thing is that another important element is when you have a calibrated model, a regional calibrated model, or a particular area, you can define control strategies and assess how these strategies and what is the degree of contribution to the model. Identify the receivers. What are the critical receivers? Where do I locate resources? What are the sectors affected? What is the population that could be affected by my decision? In the case, those planning industrial developments or industrial placement in regions, you can determine the best areas to settle because you can reach the pollution areas or a group of sources. Lastly, we can relate air quality levels compared to the scenarios that you created. In other words, the model allows you to understand a phenomenon, understand source and receiver for decision making. I don't know if you have any questions. This is basically my presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Engineer Santiago, for your kind presentation. Gives us a context on how modeling is an input for public policy making. And as you mentioned, next we're going to pass the floor to receiver model. We have a special guest in Medellin, Enrique Ferreira, who's from Mexico. All these sessions has been recorded and they are going to be uploaded in the transferencia for your memories. Next, Miriam Gomez Manrique. She's director of environmental research, GIHAM, in the Jaime Sasa Polytechnic Institute. She's director and coordinator of projects of the United Nations for the International Atomic Energy in the use of analytic nuclear techniques for understanding and receive atmosphere material, understanding urban centers in Latam and the Caribbean. She's co-founder of the air quality monitoring Red Valle de Aburrá network.
ahí? Profesora Miriam, buenos días. No, no, no te escuchamos, no, señora. De pronto tiene bloqueado el micrófono, pero no está bien. Bueno, mientras tanto, recordarles que estamos
While,
presentes
let me
en
remind you, this is our fifth session of Transference webinar. Our next session is going to be on March 9th, 2021. We invite you beforehand to participate when we're going to talk of successful cases, associations in the regional autonomous corporations of Colombia, and how entrepreneurs and public policymakers work in the bricks-making sector. We're going to give you some of those association experiences we have in Colombia.
Ahí ya,
Buenos
listo.
días, ¿ya me escuchan?
Sí, señora, perfecto.
Bueno, gracias. Esta tecnología, comprando equipos nuevos, vea lo que le pasa a uno. Bueno, por aquí estrenando un micrófono que nos dé muy buena acústica.
Listo.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Entonces,
Well, good
ya,
morning.
estamos en la presentación.
We are in a
Voy pues,
presentation.
saludarlos a todos de manera muy especial.
Kind greetings to you all.
Tener, pues, un enfoque fundamental en
I'm
la presentación,
gonna
saludando a mis profesores,
found
colegas y a los que me siguen.
gonna greet my colleagues.
Mostrar
The
cómo
main
desde
goal
el punto
is
de
how
vista
to
técnico
show
los
technically
modelos
how
se
models
convierten en un instrumento
turn
de
into
gestión
a
para la
management
identificación de
tool
perfiles de
to
fuentes
identify
acordes a la calidad del
decisions
aire.
in air quality and
Tenemos
greenhouse effect.
entonces que
We have
en, a ver por qué no me quiere dar acá la presentación.
Listo, sí, señora.
Listo, ya resolví acá el problemita de la pantalla. Muy bien. Bueno, entonces vamos a tener
well,
una introducción
we're gonna have a
fundamental
fundamental
de contexto
introduction
para
on
todos.
context
Es
for
claro
all.
que tenemos una
It is
problemática
clear we
de
have a
calidad del
problem of
aire
air quality
muy
worldwide
importante, con grandes impactos
with a great
niveles
impact from
preocupantes
urban
en los
centers.
principales centros urbanos, que se requiere la gestión
It
de
is
la calidad del
required
aire
the air
para
quality
la
management
identificación
in order
más
to
aproximada
identify
de
the
fuentes
most
de emisiones y
approximate
distribución,
the
pero
emission
muy
sources
importante con la menor
and
incertidumbre
with the
posible
lowest uncertainty
asociada a estos
associated
modelos.
to those models.
Entramos a una
We enter
herramienta fundamental que es
to
la
a
caracterización
fundamental
química de los
idea, which is the
contaminantes
chemical
atmosféricos,
characterization
con
of air
énfasis en este
pollutants,
caso que presentamos
emphasis in
material particulado, el cual se constituye una
particulate
herramienta
material,
fundamental para
which is
evaluación del impacto
fundamental
de
for
fuentes
assessing
y
the
cómo es
impact of sources,
indispensable
and
conocer
it
y
is
acercarnos a
indispensable
los perfiles de las
to
fuentes de
approach the
emisión
chemical
para poder
profiles of
tener una
emission
mayor
sources in order to
aproximación
have a
a
better
estos aportes,
approach
tanto
to
en
those
los modelos de
contributions as
transporte
in transport
para
models
un tema de validación como
for
para los
validation
modelos
and
receptores.
models per sector.
Bueno, déjame que se me está pegando acá el separador de diapositivas. Disculpe. Bien, entonces con relación a lo que es
So
el
in
aporte de
relation
la
to the
contribución de fuentes,
contribution
es
of
un
sources,
concepto
it is
que
a
trata de
concept that
establecer una relación
tries to
entre las
establish a
emisiones de las
relationship
fuentes
between
con su
source
impacto
emissions
cuantitativo
and
en la calidad del
quantitative
aire.
impact in
Es
their
una
quality.
cuantificación.
It is a
Existen
quantification.
diferentes
There are
métodos de
several
modelación,
methods of
entre ellos
modeling.
los modelos
Amongst
receptores,
those,
y como
receiver
todo modelo
models.
tiene la
As
característica que
every
simplifican
model,
la
it has
realidad
the
para
characteristic of
producir un
simplifying
sistema de
a reality in
información
order
que a
to
partir de
produce an
sus
information
informaciones
system
nos pueda
that for
acercarnos
estimations
verdaderamente a la
approaches
actuación sobre
us
las fuentes
to
y
acting on,
disminución de impactos.
on the sources.
¿Por qué es relevante conocer
Why
este
is it
parámetro?
relevant
Este
to
es el
have
objetivo de
this
nuestra reunión, es la
parameter?
construcción
It
y la
is for
implementación de
building
políticas para la protección de la salud
It is to protect the health and environment by decision makers based on scientific data. This is important for space distribution and source assessment, contributing to pollution based on those elements. It is important to build strategies and effective mechanisms to reduce the exposures to the risk of exposure and health affectation. As coordinator of the National Program of Contribution of Aerosols in LATAM and the Caribbean, we are working since 2018. We're doing a specialized study in order to estimate the regional contribution, the contribution of neighbors, as our former speaker told us. The relevance of knowing and where does raw material come from, and they have to study them. So, how to identify contributions? These contributions are identified basically to what we have seen. Could I understand with this information, he helped me to have physical distribution of receivers, and this is fed by methodological data. In our model case, receiver models and other that are inversed, we understand the receptor in order to go to the source, and these receptor to source model are fed by concentration. So we take real data we receive in order to reach the receiver. Several methods: emission inventory, chemical reconstruction, inverse modeling, neuronal network, transport models, and receiver model as particular case that is based in the variables I'm going to introduce. Basically, these models are oriented to the source, focusing transportation and transformations starting in the source, and they continue to receptor. Being with the receptor, reaching the source, I receive everything in order to reach the source. Engineer Santiago told us about the specialty of transportation model in order to do reverse analysis. These are pathways we find, and they are to space. This is the well, in this case, this is a fiber represented. This is a quartz filter for PM2.5. This is the particle catcher, and we return it from there. So what do we need for in these models in order to make a balance? We need a chemical balance, fundamental to have a chemical characterization, and there are several techniques to do analysis of factors that are associated to sources, a set of data using robust networking and several computing systems. This is widely differentiated. Basically, this is the field of atmospheric sciences. Receiver models start from air quality data with their chemical corresponding analysis. In great scale, they reveal a mix of sources, and from specificities and advances in adjustments of the model from chemical data, you can reach a small source number. We call it small. Normally, they are 5 to 7 identified sources. We can run it selectively for each of those pollutants. One of those is the one developed, and it is very reliable because it is very strong in processing. It is the PMF, positive factorization matrix. It is fed by certain characteristics that I'm going to present. It determines the profile of a source or a group of factors associated to that group. It contributes with the mass per factor, and the model then processes as a chemical balance. It makes a robust system analysis that gives us I have the analysis of the mass of analyzed in the lab. These balances are supported by pre-existing studies. something with the receiver models, they require existing prior information. Don't go databases that are valid but belong to other regions. It is important to recognize the precedence, the origin of those data, and have knowledge on those sources. This is one of the great advantages of the model on which we have more expertise and we can work with. There are several models work with EPA. This is the description of limits. This presentation stays for you, so then you see what is the difference. The CMV requires to feed the base. In the end, they went to the fuente. On the contrary, we have a set of sources, we have a set of profiles, and we need to study those in order to identify ourselves. These three models are combined and you adjust information, which is what we have. This is the balance. This is a sample of P 2.5, PM 2.5. This sample should be represented in several contributions per element or per source. And the consumption is the J component, and a component already have. The J component I have in array. Oh. This is the global structure. Our question is, what is the contribution per source? Aluminum, calcium, other composed elements. This is the filter we applied. The idea is a global balance that helps me to have a view of the species should be higher to zero to establish determination. Contributions should be positive, especially P need. Change of chemical reactivity is not included in the modeling, but it allows secondary sources associated to chemical transformation. This is the general scheme of the model. Starts with samples. In the case of particulate material, fundamental analysis of chemistry for the whole balance, and after in emission, it is fundamental to feed CMB with local data. We need to go to special sources that are very differential, and they could, in several sampling, they are based in technical restriction, and they comply the characteristics that are truly representative. Location need to be clear, related to monitoring at source, and the generalities of the receiver models were the new. The objective of the model is to solve a chemical balance and identify ponderations. A mathematical model gives me several solutions that allow to set assets by a several group. There are several models allowing that each technique, depending on the degree of knowledge you have in the source and profiles, when applying a model, we need to know what is the information available and what is the amount of data we require in a model in order to have a better approach. This has a great reliability model, PMF and PCA in collection of data is really reliable and allows by linear and direct regression associated regression through complex variables and statistics define a data convergence that it has less machine time, but it requires expert work, allowing to adjust until we reach a variable that is convergent of data. This is a matricial model defined on the number of ways, number of species, number of factors considered in modeling. Now, we characterize chemically It is
son
fundamental.
diferentes
There are
técnicas.
several techniques,
Estamos hablando de análisis multitécnicos,
multi-technical
donde
analysis, depending on resources available. The best resource is
me
the
permite
one that allows me
definir en un momento dado
to
pues,
define
cuál es la especie que
what
voy a
is
analizar
the
o en qué
species,
estado se encuentra.
the
Al
specimen I'm
momento
going to
tenemos
analyze.
experiencia en acoplado
We
de
have
masas,
experience in
métodos
mass
XRF,
coupling,
diferentes técnicas de análisis de metales.
the
En el momento,
metal
por ejemplo,
analysis
acá
in the
estamos
project
combinando la técnica
NACAL.
acoplada de masas
We are
con la
analyzing
energía dispersiva,
coupled mass technique
XRF.
with dispersive
Hemos
energy.
avanzado en técnicas
We have advanced
nucleares,
in
toda
nuclear
vez que este
techniques
proyecto
since
está
this
auspiciado
project
por la Organización
is
de
supported by
Energía
the International Organization of Atom Energy, supported by the Geological Services of Colombia. EO chromatography, and very important the work with the technical optical work with talometer immersion to determine biomass fractions, volatile fraction, associated mass, and everything related to the links of CAC, determining the, well, this is a topic that is being dealt with worldwide. I know Professor Nestor has attended certain congresses. This is the summit of Latam and the Caribbean that gather experts from Europe and South America to see our techniques of modeling to approach regional contributions. We have monitoring. This is a fundamental project. It shows important advances in carbon fractions. I don't want to stop here, but carbon fractions allow to differentiate the contribution of the source having to do with combustion, mobile and fixed sources compared to other group sources. It is very rich to understand the problem. This is the matrix of the representation of a specific analysis in micrograms and concentrations. For each element, we have determined up to 45 chemical elements plus organic fractions through nuclear analysis. It should be submitted to mass balance because it is not possible to find. Very present is calcium associated to a molecule. It has lost its properties. We need to keep it in mind when it is identified as calcium or associated to a crystalline. Exploitation is really important to keep this relevance into mind. Today we have advanced in techniques mass balance, determining pseudo elements where it is possible to do analysis of the amounts that are in every particle and what it represents a set of samples. These are associated to analysis, direct analysis or indirect analysis techniques, depending on the restraints of analysis. This is what we have worked lately. This reconstruction allows me to reach the determination of black carbon, elemental black carbon, different from elemental or the black carbon itself. It directly is associated to absorption, the lack and anthracitic, almost pure carbon coming from our magma or organic matters, everything that has the carbon structure that is associated to natural sources or non-natural sources. Crucial to understand the soil, rocks, desert, and other transportation like the dust of Sahara. So, modeling techniques allow me to apply certain chemical equations based on 11 methods that today we have established in the scientific communities worldwide, especially Dr. Cho, that contributed to the science a lot. Chemical components individually need to be associated to the type of specimens that are most relevant according to sources. It is important to measure calcium or a soluble or insoluble component how it is associated to a determined organic material, elemental carbon, or mineral mass. These are sequences. We have assessed those in this project, and they have given massive advances with great approach. It tells me the amount of mass field has to have. This model is going to give me the reliable results. This is the application of the 11 models where you see so many hands, many techniques are giving us good approach, good information on what we are studying. Now we're going to establish the profiles of sources. And PME, it gives me this solution, but other models no. There's literature reported on what is the characteristics of a diesel emission. These are the carbon fractions. We identified carbon fractions for the main sources. This is very important variable. We're working with high weight. We made a database analysis on all the specimens that we can share with you. It shows the several sources in several ranges, and we can see, just to see a case very rapidly. For instance, LC, the range we found is that sources are very close. The biomass burning, this could oscillate 35 to 57 in the brick making sector. It oscillates between 0.05 and 76, which is a value that we are associated to technology. We now several ideas of technology and modeling. It is worth to have the 83 zone. We can find a wide variety. That's why it is complex to have these models fed by these databases, because the model adjusts mathematically, giving a mass balance. It is important to have regional background, because this contribution from the neighbors allow us to see how much I receive from our surrounding countries and what is the transoceanic transportation, and very important in carbon and marine salts presence. This is widely, this database we haven't updated. These data belong to 2011. This is an approach to our sources in some of the criteria, but it is important to have a next project nationwide to know more of these profiles. These are our validations. They are within average. Some of those are above the levels reported by the scientific literature. This information allows me to infer. Before running the model, I have to know what I can find, because otherwise, what it takes, I have to do a regression in order to find it. It is important that receiver model, for every type of source, it shows a characteristic distribution or set of elements that belong to their nature. It is kind of a digital print. This is based in linear statistic relationships, especially Pearson quotient, that allows to find that when we have linear regression, similar regressions, they come from the same source. It is likely we have divergent, and we need to apply multidimensional methods to reach individual sources. This is an example of what we have found. Clear relationships between aluminum and silica. There's a source contributing with silica and aluminum. This allows to find diesel related to lithium and vanadium. If I have a correlation there, I have in that filter sources like that. This is our matrix correlation. Numbers in pink have a good correlation. So we can expect the model. I can know I have biomass, secondary sources, sulfate fractions, and this is really important in the case of the brick making sector. Presence of aluminum, calcium, iron, titanium, and potassium. This is not the only one, but this is the fingerprint of brick making. You can share. We are generating a study shared with some colleagues. A deep review on scientific reports. They gives us the profile of sources. We are reported in to have these final minutes. We are going to tell you what we have found in Colombian results. Most importantly, how this is included in the metropolitan area, and this has been communicated to the Colombian Ministry of Environment. We are doing this study in a very populational characteristic area defined by UN that doesn't have direct source influence, but there are sources. This is the sector of Belén, Mercedes, Medellín, Antioquia. We have sources, a sector of mining exploitation, and we have a brick making source. Since being in the direction and area, we found the initial understanding. This has been characterized in population activities in order to be compared to other LATAM regions and the Caribbean. This is our mass balance. It is really important. We have had an 85% mass balance with 0.89 between mass reproduced and mass taken, and we fulfill the modeling requirements that are being recommended, not so wide, 80 to 100%, 120 for an approximate modeling. This produced the particulate average in a populational area with influence of transportation in activities that the population does every day. In a vehicle, they go to work. There are other means of transportation to take people to the schools, commercial activities, but they don't have direct humane participation. Chemically, this reproduces a mass balance with a relevance of 60% in organic matters, without including elemental carbon, which is 4%. This is associated directly to combustion, and it is really important with the part of minerals, and this part of minerals, 11%, tells me that there's presence of suspended materials in the close industries. So this is the correlation we do. This is the variable crossing. We have applied nuclear techniques, and we have reached the range 0.01 grams in the nano area. These particles have calcium, iron, magnesium, zinc. This is suspended dust because of transportation of materials, soils. There's a source that the model is not going to identify. We enriched the factor where it's validated, and we found the most enriched elements. It calls attention zinc. It is really important, their contributions through pneumatic. These are the elements found. So soil are enriched. Our analysis in terms of organic matters have allowed to identify the presence of burnings, fires in the most identified. This is very typical of 2019, where we have an August situation where we have peaks, parallel PM 2.1, the organic fraction separated in a lower range of temperature determine the lower wavelengths, indicating the presence of burning or fire. This is important because there's also effect of, I have suspicion of what I have in my model. I have a correlation of TOR, biomass of source of combustion sources, and we see the print. Potassium Another trace of biomass we have found in filter, and it is also important other elements. This indicates that it is really important to have association correlations. Obviously, we haven't found all of the material. We have exhaustions, non-exhaustion, other tracers of resuspended dust. It is the exhaustion of brake pads and tires, and exploitation on dusty suspended materials. This is really important. Black carbon is really important. This is direct measurement in the whole area, not direct correlation, because these methods are not comparable, but it allows us, or in the fragmental part, this is causing the climate change, black carbon. The range is 40-60%. This is another moment where we can see associated to transportation or thermal inversion. It is already categorized. Out of that, we have worked with experts, a group of experts in sciences and industrial, where we have received support with Ecopetrol oil company. We had a debate on the sources. What do they believe are the most important sources and most relevant ones? In their consensus, what they consider is more important. The consensus in diesel, just as an example, they expect that a profile has the majority SaOC, minority oxides are part of metals, and traces that really validate the average profile reported in the literature and their model produces. So we can have an approach. These are the profiles of the model. This model tells us that in the Valle of Aburrá, in the west of the city, with the influence of activities, traffic, and population, I have industrial emissions with a source important contribution of SEO and EC2, which is elemental carbon fraction in combustion plus acid particles. EC2, EC3 added to selenium. Selenium is a trace matter in carbon chain determined by nuclear, plus magnesium, aluminum, calcium, titanium. It calls attention because it is a trace matter from the Sahara. It identifies secondary sources. There are transformation processes. There are certain profiles that allows us to separate diesel and gasoline. The profiles are different because of their characteristics. We can discuss after time. And fundamentally, we identify a suspended dust source mixed with a biomass burning source and a mix that the model identifies as soluble. This is a mix of sources that the model doesn't separate, but we in the second phase are going to separate. In a second phase, we finished model not long ago. We have reached to separate certain components of that. So we have 7 factors that allow us to think with clarity. Diesel is important in analysis, gasoline, but obviously this modeling requires adjustments. It requires certain additional adjustments to adjust the correlationship, the ratio between the equation that leads me to convergence, determine as expected Q, and approach to the specimens. This is the contribution of sources for a populational area in Medellin. People live, take transportation, go to work, use vehicles, and there's a close source, a set of sources also. We see it calls attention the diesel and gasoline participation. It doesn't have much participation in heavy duty trucks. The rest is gasoline, but nevertheless, it shows relevance of particulate material of diesel. It is important to show carbon sources, industrial emissions. This could be specified by specimen, and we have taken those to the air quality management plans. This is the digital print generated by this profile. It specifies each specimen what is the main contributor of that emission, industrial, red, secondary emissions, what is the relevance. And we see in each of carbon sources and fractions. Diesel is really important in EC2 fraction. We don't have all separation. And it allows me to have characteristics of each specimen. So we have our profile, we have the print of that profile. Now we're going to identify it. It allows compare a background Santa Elena or a rural populated area. Santa Elena is to the east of the city. It has different industrial emission profiles. So we compare areas or zones, and it shows influence in each of those. And it gives me where I have more influence of transportation or more influence of biomass according to specimen analysis. It allows to compare traffic, high traffic zones, for example, Politécnico Station, Metro Station, crossed by the most important ways of a city, the three transversal areas where there's heavy traffic. Clearly, we can identify the difference. In EC, elemental carbon, 21% for a traffic area compared to 4% in a residential area. Other parameters were analyzed. What do we recommend for strengthening measures in the metropolitan area of the Abu Valley? The mayor's office are supporting us. We have a panel of experts, and we ask them what are the measures they consider priority to avoid HECA period. Here in my window, I see something I don't see. It is clouds. It is just cloudy pollutants. I could see green 100 meters away. I don't see that. The city started accumulating. Basically, we need to work in expansion and modernization of transportation, policies to reduce the impact of cargo transportation, and promotion of the bike by availability of an integrated public bike system. Industrial control, but let's say this is fundamental. So we included in the public policy, in the plan of mobility, origin, destiny, what is the reduction of transportation to reduce the carbon print and reduce black carbon, and obviously to reduce PM, how we need to focus in strengthening and optimization of fixed source control. No matter how much or little they contribute, it is necessary to work in those specimens. It is really important. It is really important to have a program of monitoring dispensers, power distribution, gasoline distribution, and we have recommended where to do it and how to do it, strengthening the recovery systems, implementing protected areas in air protected areas in order to have these urban areas that have critical sources not to reach higher levels. This is a work supported by many people, the Ecopetrol Oil and Gas Company, and other colleagues with certain relevant conclusions. There's evidence of enriching of extra emissions derived by photochemistry and burning biomass. We have identified 20 micrograms because of pandemics when we didn't have those sources. It was possible to advance in organic analysis to differentiate gasoline profiles and biomass burning. Fundamental the work of biomass, we need to cover in several angles: regulation, technical knowledge, and monitoring of a robust system that allows to see that we declared in Aburra Valley, Bogota, likewise in these periods as periods of episode management. We do match burning biomass periods. This is some of the conclusions we have. These are, and we need to have monitoring programs in transportation and suspended area, which is the part we have to analyze in our group of work in the Polytechnic University and the National University professors. We're going to work strongly in satellites, and we are adjusting receiver model with Professor Nestor and other colleagues that work in that topic in order to adjust and define profiles. Thank you very much. I apologize for the time I took. I did my best effort. I believe everything is important for you to know that receiver model are a very good tool, a powerful tool to validate. Transportation models are fed by theoretical specimens, baselines, compared to structures. In order to reach the convergence of the model.
Muchas
Thank you.
gracias, profesora Miriam, por tu presentación. Un muy buen estudio y tu experiencia pues nos llenan de conocimiento. Muchísimas gracias. A continuación, le doy paso también al profesor Néstor Rojas de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Él es profesor asociado al Departamento de Ingeniería Química y Ambiental de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, sede Bogotá, y también es director del Grupo de Investigación en Calidad del Aire de la misma
We have
universidad.
Nestor Rojas
Buenos días,
from the
profesor
National
Néstor.
University.
Ahí ya vemos tu presentación, pero no te escuchamos.
Muy buen día.
Listo, profesor, ya te escuchamos bien.
Buen día a todos.
Listo, profe, buenos días.
Bueno, les extiendo un saludo
Kind
desde
greetings
Bogotá
from
a
Bogota
los asistentes.
and all attendants.
Quisiera saber si ya se ve bien mi presentación.
Sí, señor, sí, señor.
Perfecto. Voy a
¿Sí
pasar.
puedes hacer para ampliarla? Listo, perfecto. Sí, señor.
Bueno, muy bien, gracias. Este es el resultado de un
This is the
trabajo que
result of a
hemos
work we've
realizado
done
ya hace un tiempo,
some
hace
time
unos años, pero
ago,
que
and
nos tomó un tiempo
it took some
consolidar
time to
y publicar,
consolidate and
que tiene que ver
release.
con la aplicación
It
de
has
los
to do
modelos
with
de
the
receptor
application of
que
receptor modeling
introdujo la profesora
introduced by Professor Miriam
en dos municipios
in two
del área
municipalities of the metropolitan Bogota area.
de Bogotá, que son Soacha
They
y
are
Mosquera.
named Soacha and Mosquera.
Este fue un trabajo que hicimos
This
para
is a
la
work we've
Corporación
done for the
Ambiental
regional
Cundinamarca,
Cundinamarca
y
Environmental
lo-
Corporation, CAR,
tuvimos la colaboración de la
and we
Universidad
had the
de
collaboration of Wisconsin
Madison.
University, Madison.
El artículo
The
que acaba de ser
paper
publicado
that was released
muestra los resultados
not
de
long
este
ago
estudio
showing
en
the
la revista
results,
Atmósfera.
it is in
Aún
Atmosphere
está
Journal,
en
Atmosfera
la
Journal.
sección
It is in
de
the section
early release,
early release.
y próximamente pues ya estará en su versión final.
We're gonna
Los
have the
invito
final
entonces a
version
consultarlo en
shortly.
esta revista.
I invite you to check this journal.
Bien,
Well,
entremos entonces en materia. Los municipios de Soacha y
Municipality
Mosquera,
Soacha Mosquera
que están al occidente de la
are
ciudad de
to
Bogotá,
the west of
pues
Bogota,
se han visto que están
and
creciendo
they've
muy
seen they
rápidamente.
grow rapidly.
Pues Soacha es una ciudad
Soacha
de más
is
de
almost a
100.000
city,
habitantes,
500,000
y
inhabitants.
pues allí han
And
recibido muchas
they
empresas que han
received many
salido
companies that have
del
left
distrito capital
the
de
capital
Bogotá,
district Bogota,
debido pues en parte a
due in
presión de la
part
autoridad
to the
ambiental.
pressure of
Entonces
the
se han
environmental
movido hacia
authorities.
allá,
They have
han
moved
hecho sus
to other
instalaciones
towns,
en Mosquera y
surrounding
Soacha,
neighboring towns, Soacha in this
y
case.
pues entonces
And
se tiene una oportunidad o la
we have
posibilidad
the
de que
possibility
la
that
contaminación allí pues esté
pollution
aumentando.
is increasing in those towns.
Ya
As a matter of fact, they have a high pollution now, and there are many sources out of the existing long time ago compared to the received not long ago, and they are neighboring to the most polluted area of Bogota, which is the west of Bogota. This southwest and west Bogota are the most polluted areas, and Soacha and Mosquera are neighbors. So it is very likely, in some measures, we have demonstrated that they have high pollution. Nevertheless, we don't know much. We know some of the inventories of emissions. We don't have accuracy on the modeling, including the whole metropolitan area. With that background, we wanted to make a study to determine the contribution of several sources to particulate material less than 2.5 in Soacha and Mosquera. Using a particularity, we used organic markers, not only aggregated pollutants, elemental organic carbon or metals, but also we included organic markers that allow us to differentiate between sources, combustion sources. We had a receptor in each of the municipalities. Soacha receptor and Mosquera receptor in the urban areas in each municipality. Here, there are the photos, one measurement site. And we took samples during 2 months, September, November 2014, like 7 years ago. And we used these samplers that are called RMP, also known as ChemCom. They are used in some equipment, for example, Parquesol. And we used Teflon filters and quartz filters. Each sample was collected during 24 hours at a flow 16.7 liters per minute. Teflon filters were conditioned at 20 degrees plus minus 5, 50% HR before every weighing, before and after weighing, and quartz filters were pre-cooked at 600 degrees during 16 hours to eliminate any organic matter that could be present, polluting those filters. So we didn't have that pollution. After collection, samples were stored at minus 20 before chemical analysis. We did several analysis techniques: organic, water-soluble carbon, ions, elemental, organic carbon, organic markers, metals. These tool us gas chromatography and mass detector. For this last analysis, we had aggregations. We selected for analysis 3 samples per week for ions and organic soluble carbon, and composed samples for organic markers and gas chromatography. We joined together several samples to extract by this technique, gas chromatography. Every composed sample had at least organic carbon 500 micrograms. They were marked with a standard isotopic solution to do a good quantification, and they were extracted in ultrasound during 20 minutes in successive extractions with acetone and dichloromethane. So total, it was hour and a half extraction period. Then after concentration of sample, and
ya el tratamiento
afterwards, the
de las muestras para
sample
el
treatment
análisis de
for
cromatografía.
chromatography analysis.
Bien. Posteriormente, cuando ya tuvimos los
Afterwards,
resultados
when we add the
ese
results
análisis
of
químico,
that chemical
entonces
analysis,
utilizamos
we
el
used
modelo de balance de químico de masas o chemical mass
mass
balance
chemical
de
balance
la EPA,
by EPA,
versión
version
8.2.
8.2.
Cada muestra era
Each
entonces
sample
representativa de una semana y
represented
para los
1 week,
meses de
and
muestreo
for the 2
tuvimos
months,
8 muestras
we had 8
compuestas.
samples, composed
Los
samples.
resultados de la aplicación del
Results
modelo fueron
were
aceptables
deemed
si R
acceptable
era
if
superior a
R2
0,9,
it was higher to
como
0.9,
lo habían referenciado
as
en varias
referenced
otras
in several
publicaciones
publications.
anteriores adoptando esta metodología. Utilizamos los
We
perfiles
use
químicos
the
de las
chemical
fuentes
profiles of
de
sources
estos autores que resumimos
by
en esta
these
tabla
authors, summarized in this chart,
para la combustión de
for diesel
gasolina,
combustion,
gas natural,
gasoline, natural gas,
el humo de leña,
wood
combustión
smoke,
de leña,
combustion,
y la quema de
and
carbón
coal
en
burning
in
in
pequeñas instalaciones.
small facilities.
Y utilizamos
And
estos
organic
marcadores
markers were
orgánicos
used
dentro de
as
los que
follows.
analizamos por
We
cromatografía de
analyzed
gases con
by
detector
gas
de masas,
chromatography with mass detector,
levoglucosan, por ejemplo, varios
levoglucosan,
hidrocarburos aromáticos
several
policíclicos,
aromatic polycyclic
algunos opanos,
hydrocarbons,
que son muy buenos
organic
trazadores
carbons,
de la
the
combustión de
opans,
gasolina y diésel,
markers of
especialmente gasolina,
gasoline and biodiesel and diesel combustion,
los
and
colestanos,
cholestanos,
y
cytostanos, and
alcanos del
alkanes,
27 al
27
33,
to
con cadenas de
33,
27 a
with
33
chains
carbonos.
27 to
Ese
33
fue entonces
carbons.
algunos de
These
los
were
detalles de
some of the
los
details of
perfiles
the
químicos de las fuentes
chemical
y
profiles of sources,
de
source chemical profiles, and
del PM2.5
the
ambiental
PM
que utilizamos.
2.5 we analyzed.
Bien, entonces para ya mostrarles los resultados,
To show
esta es
results, this is
la composición
the composition,
agregada
aggregated composition
de estas muestras
of
que
those
tuvimos en las 8
samples
semanas.
in 8
Entonces,
weeks.
como vemos, hay un
As you can
fuerte
see, there's a strong
componente de
presence
carbón
of
orgánico, de
organic
material orgánico
carbon,
y de
organic
iones,
matter,
que son
and
una parte
ions.
importante de la masa, y por
These are
supuesto el carbón
important part of the
elemental
mass and
también, que
elemental
no es
carbon,
mayoritario.
which is not majority.
En la gráfica de la derecha,
In
a
the
la
right,
izquierda vemos
in the left
entonces la
side,
composición
we
para
see
Soacha,
the
y
Soacha
en Mosquera lo
composition,
que
and in
hicimos fue
Mosquera,
hacer una sustracción
we did a
de Soacha
subtraction,
menos Mosquera
Soacha
para
minus
ver
Mosquera,
si queda positivas
to
esas
see the
concentraciones, pues
positive
quiere decir que las
concentration.
concentraciones son
If
más
it is
altas en
positive,
Soacha,
it
si son
means that
negativas, quiere
concentrations were higher in
decir que son
Soacha, and
más
if it is
altas
negative,
en Mosquera.
it is more
¿Por qué lo
concentration in
hicimos? Porque
Mosquera.
son
Why did we
dos
do that? Because
puntos, dos
they
receptores en
were
la
two
misma
receptors in the
cuenca atmosférica,
same
entonces
atmospheric
puede que haya
basin.
algunas
There
similitudes
could be
entre
similarities
las
between
composiciones,
those
y si no es
compositions.
así,
If it
entonces
is not that way,
principalmente se puede deber a
principally
fuentes
we
locales.
could refer to local
A
sources.
continuación les presentaré cuáles fueron de manera
I'm going to
similar a
show
esta,
you
cuáles fueron
similar
las
what
concentraciones
were
de
the
diferentes
concentrations
compuestos
of several
trazadores orgánicos.
organic tracer
Bueno,
markers.
primero empecemos con los
Let's
carbono
start
orgánico
with
elemental.
elemental
Entonces tenemos
carbon. We
esta
have these
variación a lo
variations
largo de las 8 semanas
throughout 8
en
weeks
Soacha.
in
Tuvimos
Soacha.
una
We had
semana
a
con
peak in
concentraciones
week 7
pues,
with
significativamente más altas que
significantly
las
higher
demás.
concentrations.
Y
And in
casi en todas las
Mosquera,
semanas,
in
el
almost in
carbono
all
orgánico
weeks, the
elemental
organic
fue más
elemental
alto en
carbon
Soacha
was higher
que en
in
Mosquera.
Soacha than Mosquera.
Con respecto a los hidrocarburos
In
aromáticos
aromatic
policíclicos,
polycyclic
tenemos
hydrocarbons,
estas
we
tres
had
especies
these
muy
3
representativas,
chemical
el
samples,
benzofluoranteno,
specimens,
fluoranteno y
fluorantano,
benzopireno,
benzofluoranteno,
que tienen una
benzopireno.
contribución similar
They
a
have
las
similar
otras,
concentration
con
in
un
all
poco más de
samples,
abundancia
with
del
more abundance
benzofluoranteno.
of benzofluoranteno.
Acá nos damos cuenta que para estos compuestos
We
hay
noticed that
varias
for
compuestos que
some
tienen
compounds,
concentraciones significativamente más
there
altas
are
en Mosquera,
significantly higher concentrations in Mosquera than in Soacha. We think from now that there's a higher important contributor, gasoline burning in Mosquera, for example, compared to Soacha. In regard to opanes, there are good markers of gasoline combustion. We noticed that for all the weeks, concentrations are higher in Mosquera than in Soacha. So
de
that
combustión de gasolina,
combustion
los
source,
vehículos
gasoline,
eléctricos,
mobile
entonces
sources
parecen ser pues buenos, mucho más
are
altos contribuyentes
higher
en Mosquera
contributors
que
in
en
Mosquera
Soacha.
compared to Soacha.
Respecto a los alcanos,
In
tenemos una situación
alkanes,
similar.
alkanes, we have a similar situation.
El piseno es
Picen
muy importante en
is
este
really
estudio
important in
porque es
this
un
study because
excelente
it is an
trazador,
excellent marker,
casi que único
a
trazador
unique marker
de la quema de carbón.
of burning coal.
Y vemos cómo en
And we
algunas de
noticed
las
that in
semanas
some of the
hay
weeks
mayores
there's
concentraciones en
higher
Mosquera y
concentration
otras
in
semanas hay
Mosquera,
mayores
and in
concentraciones
other
en
weeks
Soacha.
are higher concentrations in
Entonces,
Soacha.
no
So
hay una, digamos, consistencia
there's
temporal
no temporary
respecto a la mayor abundancia en este
temporal concentration in
tanto,
this
entonces, se
regard.
esperaría que las
So
contribuciones fuentes
contribution of sources
de quema de carbón
of
a
burning
cada
coal
municipio
in
pues,
each
vaya
municipality
cambiando con el tiempo.
changes with the pass
Es
of
decir,
time.
depende mucho
That
del
depends
momento
on the
en el que
moment
se esté midiendo.
where you are measuring.
El levoglucosano es
Levoglucosano,
un trazador pues,
glucosan,
por excelencia de la
it
quema de
is
biomasa.
marker of biomass.
Tuvo un comportamiento diferente a los
It
compuestos
had a
anteriores
different
porque
behavior
su
because
abundancia
the abundance
es mucho
is
mayor
much more
en
higher
Soacha que en
in
Mosquera.
Soacha than
De manera
Mosquera.
que vemos la diferencia siempre es positiva, de manera que tenemos más
The
abundancia
difference is
en
always
Soacha que en
positive.
Mosquera.
We have more abundance in Soacha than in
Bien, cuando
Mosquera.
hacemos este tipo
When we
de
do
diagramas de
these
relaciones entre
diagrams,
compuestos,
correlations between compounds,
como los que vemos acá,
as we see
benzo,
here,
GHI,
benzo,
pereleno
GHA,
y
perileno,
sobre carbón
and
elemental,
elemental carbon,
indeno,
indeno, and pireno,
sobre carbón elemental,
on elemental
pues
carbon.
podemos compararlos con los
We can
perfiles de las fuentes
compare
y ver
with the
más o menos dónde
sources
se sitúan las
and
muestras.
where samples
Entonces
are
vemos las
located.
muestras de Soacha
We noticed
están lo
Soacha
más cercanas a
samples
esta
are
línea que
close.
une la quema de biomasa con la de diésel. De
This
manera que
relates
puede
diesel
tener, podemos
biomass
tener una
burning.
fuerte
We could
influencia de esas
have a
dos fuentes
strong
en
influence of
Soacha.
those
En
two sources
Mosquera,
in Soacha.
por su parte, tenemos una mayor influencia de, o sea, se aproxima más a los puntos
There's much more
representativos de
influence approach to the
gasolina,
representative
de la fuente de
points
gasolina,
of gasoline
y
sources
con una
and
influencia también más o menos
influence
importante de la quema
of
de
burning
carbón.
coal.
Una vez hacemos entonces la corrida del modelo de receptor del CMB en los dos municipios,
In two municipalities, we obtained
para carbón orgánico.
for
Vemos
organic
cómo en
carbon.
Soacha, pues, hay una
We saw in
fuerte
Soacha
influencia,
there's a
un fuerte
strong
aporte de la
influence, a
quema
contribution
de
of
leña,
burning wood.
mientras que en
And in Mosquera, there's
es menor
lower
esa contribución.
component of
Mientras
burning
que
wood.
en Mosquera es
In
mayor la
Mosquera, we have
contribución
higher
de
contribution
gasolina
of
que
gasoline
en
burning
Soacha.
compared to Soacha.
Y vemos también un
We
mayor
noticed
componente
a
de
bigger component
otras fuentes
of other
que pueden ser
sources that
asociadas,
could
por
be
ejemplo,
associated
a los aerosoles orgánicos
to
secundarios
organic
en
secondary
atmósfera,
aerosols in
formados en
atmosphere,
atmósfera,
formed in the atmosphere
en Soacha
in
más que en
Soacha
Mosquera.
compared to Mosquera.
Bien. Convirtiendo esos resultados
Turning
a
all
PM
this to PM
2.5
2.5
mediante algunas técnicas
by
de
certain
reconstrucción de masa que
mass
nos
reconstruction
comentó un poco
techniques
la profesora
told
Miriam,
us by
pues
Professor Miriam,
obtenemos este tipo de
we
resultados
add
ya
these
a
results.
cuánto aporta cada
What is
fuente
the contribution
a PM
per
2.5,
source?
no solo a
PM
carbón
2.5,
orgánico.
not only organic
Y vemos
carbon.
entonces
And we
pues, la
see
importancia
the
de
relevance
la
of
quema de leña,
burning wood
de la combustión de
and
diésel también
diesel
en
combustion in
Soacha,
Soacha
y el componente
and
de
the
aerosoles
component of
secundarios.
secondary
Son
aerosols.
los componentes más
These are the
importantes en
most
Soacha, mientras
contributing
que
components
en
in
Mosquera
Soacha.
vemos como
But in
es
Mosquera,
consistente
we see consistency
la mayor contribución
in
de la quema de gasolina o la combustión de gasolina en
higher.
Mosquera.
We add
Y también en algunas
comparisons
semanas
between gas
el
combustion,
aporte de carbón es
Mosquera and
más
Soacha,
importante.
and in some weeks, the contribution of carbon
Vale la
burning,
pena mencionar que
coal
también
burning
hicimos un
is different.
análisis de las
We analyzed also
trayectorias inversas
inverse trajectories,
de las
reverse
masas de aire que
trajectories of
llegaban a
air
los
masses
municipios
reaching those
y vimos
municipalities.
cómo las
And we
diferencias
noticed that
temporales pueden
temporary
estar
differences could
parcialmente
be partially
explicadas
explained
por la
by
proveniencia
the
de masas de aire de
coming of
diferentes
air
direcciones.
masses from
Entonces
several
teníamos
directions. We
un
had
clúster que venía
a cluster coming
del
from
este
the east,
y
and
traían algunas
it
masas de
brought
aire desde
certain
la
air masses
comarca
from the
Colombo
Orinoco
venezolana.
area, Colombo,
Otro
Venezuela.
clúster que tenía
Another
masas de aire
cluster
viniendo
had
más
air
desde el
masses
sur,
coming from
pasando por
southwards.
una parte incluso de la de la selva amazónica, pueden traer algunos componentes de
Some of the components
quemas
of
de
burning
bosques por
could
esa área,
be
y otro
from forest
clúster
wood
de trayectorias de
and
masas de
some
aire
other contexts.
que venía del occidente y noroccidente del país. Y
It
cada
was
uno de
coming
esos
from
aportes
east and
estuvo ligado un poco
northeast
a diferentes
of the
contribuciones
country,
de las
and
fuentes. Entonces
this is
también
related
puede
to
haber
the
una afectación de meteorología, por
contribution
supuesto.
of sources. There could
Algunos
be
detalles
affectation
están
of
en
meteorology.
el artículo
Some
que
of
les
the
mencioné.
answers are in the paper I
En
already
resumen,
mentioned. In
podríamos
summary,
entonces decir
we could
que en el
say
municipio de
that in
Soacha,
Soacha municipality,
las mayores,
the
las principales
biggest
fuentes que están
source
aportando al
of
PM2.5 allí
PM2.5
son
are
la
wood
quema
burning,
de leña, que nos pareció un
that
poco sorprendente para
we
nosotros.
got
No esperábamos
surprised
una
because we
contribución
didn't expect
tan
that
importante de la quema de leña
such an
en
important
este
contribution of
municipio.
wood
Pensábamos que
burning.
iba a
We
dominar
thought
el diésel,
it
por
was
ejemplo.
diesel, for example.
Que sí es la
Diesel is the
segunda fuente de
second
emisión,
source of
pero definitivamente
PM2.5,
fue
but
una
definitely it was a
sorpresa
big surprise to
la
find out
quema,
that
tanta
wood
quema
burning
tanto aporte de quema de leña.
was the
También
main
el aporte de
contributor.
aerosoles secundarios es
Secondary
supremamente importante
aerosols
allí.
are really important,
Y
aerosols.
esto pues es algo que
And
realmente no podemos
this is
manejar
really something we
porque
cannot
pues
manage
son
because
aerosoles
these
formados en la
are
atmósfera.
formed in the atmosphere.
Pero sí podemos actuar
We can
sobre
take
el
actions
componente de quema
on
de leña,
wood, for
diésel y
example, diesel
gasolina
and
y
gasoline
carbón.
and coal.
En Mosquera
In
hay
Mosquera,
un
we
panorama un
have
poco
a
diferente,
different landscape.
siendo que son municipios muy cercanos,
Being so
pero
close
las fuentes
municipalities,
locales
the
afectan de
local
diferente
sources
manera.
affect
Entonces
differently.
tenemos el
So we have
principal
the
aporte es de
main
gasolina, luego
source is
seguido por
gasoline
diésel,
burning, then after diesel,
luego el
then after
carbón,
coal,
luego los
and
aerosoles secundarios.
secondary
Y
aerosols.
la quema de leña en ese municipio
Wood
pues
burning
aporta mucho menos, apenas el
contributes
8% en comparación con
at
el
least
23% de Soacha. Entonces de ahí se desprenden
from there.
diferentes
We had
implicaciones en
several
política pública.
implications in public policies.
Entonces, la bondad de tener
The good
una
of having
caracterización
a
que incluya estos
characterization
compuestos
that
orgánicos
includes
pues
these
permite
organic
que
compounds
podamos determinar una contribución de fuentes con un alto
determines
grado de detalle.
sources with a high degree of
Esto
detail.
entonces se debería
So
replicar en
this
otros
could be
estudios
replicated in
en
other
diferentes
studies
ciudades
in
del país
several
y otras que
cities
no
of Colombia
en el
and
continente, por
the
ejemplo, que no han
continent, for
desarrollado
example,
este
that
tipo
haven't
de
developed these
estudios.
type of studies.
Para la alta contribución
For
de
the
quema
high
de leña en
contribution
Soacha,
of wood burning in
lo
Soacha,
que sugerimos es,
we
por
want
supuesto,
to suggest
incluir eso
to
mucho más
include these in
claramente en
public
el inventario de
policies in the
emisiones
inventory of
y
emissions
mirar dónde hay
and
que
see
mejorar las
where it is
prácticas de
important
quema
to
de leña
improve
o
practices of
sustituir
burning
la
wood
quema de
of
leña por
or
gas natural.
substitute wood for
Eh,
natural gas.
Con respecto a la alta
In high
contribución de vehículos
contribution
gasolina
of
en Mosquera,
gasoline
un
vehicles in
16%,
Mosquera municipality,
pues
we
básicamente
need to
la
promote
solución pasa por
basically
promover la
the
descarbonización del transporte,
decarbonization
buscar
of transportation,
unos medios mucho más eficientes
have more
de
efficient
transporte de
means of
pasajeros
transportation for passengers,
y
for example.
allí el proyecto
And there,
de
the
tren
project
ligero o el
of
regio
light
tram del
train,
occidente pues
regio
pasa a
tram,
ser de alta
is
importancia
highly
para
important
poder tener una
to
forma de
have
reducir o
a
desincentivar
reduction
ese
or
uso
demotivate the use
de
of
los vehículos particulares principalmente.
private cars, for example.
Con respecto a los vehículos
In
diésel,
diesel vehicles
están asociados principalmente al
associated
transporte
to
público
public
y al
transportation
transporte de carga,
and cargo
pues
transportation,
la solución de mayor
the
impacto
most impact
es, por supuesto,
solution could
renovar
be
la flota
renew
diésel.
the diesel
Todavía
fleet.
tenemos
Still,
muchos
we
vehículos
have
con
many
motor
vehicles
diésel
that
muy
have
viejo
very old
y
diesel
es
engines,
urgente
and
renovar
it is urgent to
esa
renew
flota.
that fleet.
La calidad del combustible ha
Fuel quality
mejorado
has improved
significativamente
significantly
en los últimos
during
años
the past
y
years,
ya es posible
and it
utilizar
is
las
possible
mejores
to use the
tecnologías
best
disponibles
technology
para diésel, de
available
manera
for
que
diesel.
lo que ahora hace
So
falta es
what
renovar la
is
flota.
missing is the
Y
renewal
con
of
respecto a la
the fleet,
contribución del carbón,
and
de
in
15 y 11%
contribution of
en
coal
estos dos
burning
municipios,
in these two
pues
municipalities,
hay que
it would be
promover
important or
mejor
promote
tecnología,
better
tecnología más
technologies,
limpia
cleaner
en la industria
technologies
que
in the
utiliza
industries
carbón,
that use coal,
sustituir por gas
substitute
natural
by natural
y
gas,
controlar
and
emisiones,
control
utilizar,
emissions,
promover
promote the
la aplicación, la
application,
de sistemas de
installation
control de
of
emisiones
emission control systems
después de mejorar esas
after
tecnologías
improving
y
technologies,
en lo posible
and
sustituir
if
por gas
possible,
natural.
substitute for natural gas.
Una noticia que
One
apenas hace 3 meses fue
news that
publicada
3 months ago
el
was
1 de octubre
released, October
de
29,
2020, fue
2020,
que
was in Soacha Municipality. CAR found certain illegal burnings in open place to obtain vegetal coal. This could be a source, important source of PM 2.5, of the aerosols that contribute with 23% associated to organic wood burning. These are my thanks to the entities that contributed to this project, this study. CAR, of course, sponsored Wisconsin University and Laboratory Wisconsin State for chemical analysis. They are very specialized analysis, and Fulbright and Ecopetrol for a scholarship, a research scholarship in Wisconsin University. Thank you very much, and I'm attentive to your inquiries. Thank you, Professor Nestor, for your presentation. Thank you, all speakers that are present today. We thank you very much for your kind contributions and valuable ideas for all the people present here. This is very, very important. In the chat, I haven't seen any questions. For any inquiries arising, you can send to fabio.salgado@crg.com.co, and I'm going to redirect to the speakers, and we give you an answer. Likewise, let me tell you that this session is recorded, and it is uploaded in transferencialadrillera.com and in the social network of the CAEM for checking of all attendance or the people that didn't attend today. Thank you very much for your kind presentations, for your contributions, and we kindly invite you for next sessions, March 9th, where we're going to talk associations in the brick-making sector and successful cases in autonomous environmental corporations in the reconstruction of the sector. Thank you to all attendants, all national and international guests. We had around 56 people connected to this webinar, countries such as Brazil, Mexico, United Kingdom, Asia, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Thank you, entrepreneurs, Mrs. Viviana in Quindío, and everybody that were present today. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. We hope to see you next session. Thank you.